Hello everyone, I'm the Midnight Truth here to keep you company tonight. I know many of you use these stories to fall asleep, so before we begin, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time is it there? Let's get started. Story 1. The fog is thick as milk, swallowing the road ahead. A rusted sign looms into view, its letters barely legible. Welcome to Hollow Creek, population 0. Beneath it, scrawled in red paint, turn back. Elliot Grayson slows his car to a crawl, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. The hum of the engine feels too loud, like it might wake something slumbering in the dark. He mutters to himself, population 0? That's comforting. The radio crackles suddenly, static hissing through the speakers. Elliot jumps, his hand darting to turn the dial. The static dies, leaving an oppressive silence. He exhales sharply. The phone buzzes in the cup holder. A voicemail notification. He hesitates before pressing play. Marla's voice, shaky and urgent asterisk. Elliot, it's me. I know it's been years, but you need to listen. Grimwood House, it's the key to everything. Mom, Dad, they knew, Elliot. They left it for us. But don't go at night. Just, please don't go at night. A burst of static cuts her off. Then, faintly, a whisper, watch her. Elliot grips the phone tightly, his heartbeat thundering in his ears. He glances at the dashboard clock. 9:37 p.m. Too late to turn back. He mutters, thanks for the heads up, Marla, and kills the engine. The door creaks as he steps out. The air is cold and damp, pressing against him like a wet shroud. Gravel crunches under his boots as he retrieves a flashlight from the trunk. Its beam cuts weakly through the fog. Ahead, the silhouette of Grimwood House emerges, jagged against the moonlit sky. Its windows gape like empty sockets, and the front door hangs slightly ajar, swaying in the wind. Elliot steels himself. Just a house, he whispers. Just an old, empty house. The flashlight flickers. He slaps it, the beam steadying. With each step toward the house, the air feels heavier, as if the ground itself resents his intrusion. The porch groans under his weight. The door creaks louder now, moving in slow, deliberate arcs. He pushes it open, wincing at the sound. The interior is dark, the flashlight casting long, jittery shadows. The air smells of mildew and something faintly metallic. He calls out, his voice trembling. Hello? Anyone here? Silence. The flashlight sweeps across the foyer. Dust hangs thick in the air. A grand staircase rises ahead, its banister carved with strange, swirling patterns. To the left, an arched doorway leads to a sitting room. The furniture is draped in white sheets, ghostly shapes in the gloom. A thud echoes from upstairs. Elliot freezes. His flashlight quivers in his hand. Hello? He tries again, louder this time. His voice sounds small, swallowed by the house. No answer. Another thud. Louder. Closer. He takes a step toward the staircase, then stops. His pulse pounds in his ears. Probably just a raccoon, he mutters, trying to convince himself. As he places a foot on the first step, the flashlight flickers again. The beam dances wildly before plunging him into darkness. He curses, slapping it frantically. A low, guttural whisper snakes through the air. He can't make out the words, but the tone is unmistakable. Anger. The flashlight sputters back to life. The beam lands on the top of the staircase. A figure stands there, tall, motionless, its face obscured by shadow. Elliot's breath catches in his throat. He stumbles back, his heel catching on the edge of the step. He falls hard, the flashlight clattering to the floor. When he scrambles to pick it up, the beam sweeps across the staircase again. The figure is gone. Okay, he breathes shakily. I'm losing it. This was a mistake. The door behind him slams shut. He whirls around, the flashlight barely catching the edges of the doorframe. The whisper comes again, closer this time, coiling around him like smoke. Who's there? He demands, his voice cracking. The silence stretches, oppressive and suffocating. Then, from upstairs, the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate. He takes a step back, his hands trembling. The flashlight beam dances across the walls, illuminating peeling wallpaper and faded portraits. One portrait catches his eye. It's larger than the others, dominating the wall near the base of the stairs. A man in old-fashioned clothes, his face stern and unsmiling. Something about his eyes feels wrong, too lifelike, too aware. The footsteps stop. The whisper comes again, right behind him this time. Leave? Elliot spins, the flashlight beam swinging wildly. There's no one there. His chest heaves, panic clawing at the edges of his mind. The house groans, the sound deep and resonant, as though it's alive and displeased. He bolts for the door, yanking at the handle. It doesn't budge. He pulls harder, the wood creaking but holding firm. Come on, he growls, his voice rising in desperation. A shadow moves in the corner of his vision. He spins, pressing his back against the door. The flashlight flickers, the beam growing weaker. A voice, deep and resonant, fills the air. Not a whisper this time, but a command. Stay. The light dies completely, plunging him into darkness. The darkness is absolute. Elliot's breath comes in sharp, panicked bursts. The air feels thick, clinging to his skin like cobwebs. He fumbles with the flashlight, slapping it against his palm. A faint flicker, then nothing. Come on, he whispers, his voice trembling. Don't do this to me. A sound. Faint at first, then growing louder, a low rhythmic tapping like fingers drumming on wood. It echoes through the foyer, bouncing off unseen walls. Who's there? He calls out, his voice cracking. The tapping stops. Silence. Then a faint shuffle like someone dragging their feet across the floorboards. Elliot's heart hammers in his chest. This isn't real. It's just a stupid, empty house, he mutters, trying to steady himself. A laugh, soft, cold, and unmistakably human, ripples through the air. Elliot freezes. Who's there? He demands again, louder this time. The laugh fades, leaving only the sound of his own labored breathing. The flashlight flickers back to life, weak and sputtering. The beam illuminates the sitting room to his left. The draped furniture seems to shift in the faint light, the sheets rippling as though something moves beneath them. Nope. Elliot mutters, backing away. His shoulder bumps into something solid. He yelps, spinning around. The grand staircase looms before him, its carved banister twisting like knotted vines. The steps seem to stretch upward endlessly, disappearing into darkness. He doesn't remember moving this close to it. Another sound, a low creak as if someone has just stepped onto the stairs. Okay, this isn't funny, he says, his voice rising. The flashlight beam sweeps upward. The top of the staircase is empty. He takes a shaky step back, but his heel catches on the edge of the carpet and he stumbles. The flashlight slips from his grasp, clattering to the floor. Its beam lands on the portrait at the base of the stairs. The man in the painting stares down at him, his eyes burning with something cold and furious. Elliot scrambles to his feet, grabbing the flashlight. He shines it on the portrait again. The man's expression is unchanged, stern, lifeless. Get a grip, Elliot, he mutters, wiping sweat from his brow. A noise from above, a loud, resonant thud. He freezes. The noise comes again, louder this time. Something heavy moving across the floor above him. Elliot's hands shake as he points the flashlight toward the stairs. Against his better judgment, he takes a step forward. Hello, he calls, his voice hollow and echoing. The house answers with another thud, followed by a scraping sound, like furniture being dragged across the floor. He swallows hard and starts up the stairs, each step groaning beneath his weight. Just an old house, he mutters under his breath. Just an old, creaky. A shadow darts across the top of the staircase. Elliot stops dead, the flashlight shaking in his hand. Who's up there? Silence. He takes another step, then another, his breath coming in short gasps. When he reaches the landing, he sweeps the flashlight across the hallway. The beam catches a door at the far end, slightly ajar. A faint, flickering light spills out from within. Elliot's pulse quickens. He edges closer, his footsteps slow and deliberate. The door creaks as he nudges it open with the flashlight. Inside, the room is bare except for an old wooden rocking chair in the center. It rocks gently as though someone has just risen from it. The walls are covered in strange symbols, drawn in what looks like charcoal. Circles, spirals, jagged lines, all looping and intersecting in a chaotic pattern. What the hell? Elliot whispers, stepping into the room. The flashlight beam lands on the floor. In the center of the room, scratched deep into the wood, is a single word. Watcher. The air shifts, growing colder. The door slams shut behind him. Elliot spins around, yanking at the handle, but it won't budge. His flashlight flickers wildly, casting erratic shadows across the walls. A voice, low, guttural, and filled with malice, rumbles through the room. Why are you here? Elliot's chest tightens. He swings the flashlight wildly, trying to find the source of the voice. Who said that? He shouts. The rocking chair stops abruptly as though caught in invisible hands. The voice comes again, closer this time. You shouldn't have come. The flashlight dies. Elliot presses himself against the door, panic surging through him. The air feels electric, vibrating with an unseen force. Something moves in the darkness. A faint shuffling like feet dragging across the floor. Elliot fumbles for the flashlight, slapping it frantically. It sputters back to life, casting a dim beam. The rocking chair is empty. But the symbols on the walls, they've changed. The spirals and jagged lines now form a single grotesque face, its mouth open in a silent scream. Elliot stumbles backward, his breath catching in his throat. The face moves. Its eyes dart toward him and its mouth begins to twist, forming words. Leave, before it's too late. The light dies again, plunging him into darkness. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, echo across the room, coming closer. Elliot screams. The scream dies in Elliot's throat as silence swallows the room. He presses himself against the door, every muscle locked in fear. The darkness feels alive, closing in on him like a suffocating blanket. His fingers tremble over the flashlight. He slaps it desperately. A faint sputter, then light. Weak, flickering, but enough to see the room again. The face on the wall is gone. The symbols have reverted to their original chaotic patterns. The rocking chair is still. Elliot exhales shakily, his voice a broken whisper. This isn't real. None of this is real. A sudden, sharp knock on the door behind him makes him jump. 3 deliberate raps, slow and steady. He whirls around, clutching the flashlight like a weapon. Who's there? No answer. His hand finds the doorknob, twisting it frantically. It gives and the door creaks open. He stumbles into the hallway, the air here somehow colder than the room he left behind. The faint tapping starts again, coming from somewhere deeper in the house. It echoes softly, leading him like a trail of breadcrumbs. Elliot hesitates, his instincts screaming to turn back. But something stronger, curiosity, desperation, drives him forward. The tapping grows louder as he moves. His footsteps are unsteady, the flashlight beam darting across faded wallpaper and peeling wooden trim. Ahead, a doorway yawns open, revealing a staircase spiraling downward. Basement, he mutters to himself. The word tastes wrong in his mouth, heavy and foreboding. The tapping stops. The silence stretches, taut and oppressive. Elliot edges toward the staircase, the beam of his flashlight struggling to pierce the darkness below. He freezes at the top step. A whisper, faint and disjointed, rises from the depths. Words he can't quite understand. Hello, he calls out, his voice shaky. The whisper stops abruptly, replaced by a low, guttural chuckle. Elliot's grip tightens on the flashlight. His mind screams at him to leave, to turn and run. But his feet betray him, stepping onto the first creaking stair. As he descends, the air grows heavier, pressing against his chest. The flashlight flickers, and for a moment, he's plunged into darkness. When the light returns, something shifts in the shadows below. A fleeting shape, there and gone in an instant. Who's down there? He demands, his voice wavering. No response. At the bottom of the stairs, the basement stretches before him, vast and shadowy. Old, rusted tools hang from the walls, and a workbench sits cluttered with dust-covered objects. In the center of the room, a single wooden chair faces away from him. Something rests on the seat, a small dark object he can't quite make out. The whisper returns, louder now. Closer. Watcher, watcher. Elliot's stomach churns. He steps closer to the chair, the flashlight shaking in his grip. The object on the seat comes into focus. A blackened, withered doll, its glass eyes cracked and its mouth stitched shut with coarse thread. He recoils, the whispering intensifying around him. Watcher, watcher. The word repeats, overlapping, multiplying, until it becomes a deafening chant. Elliot covers his ears, shouting over the noise. Stop. Just stop. The chanting ceases instantly, replaced by the sound of heavy breathing, directly behind him. He spins, the flashlight beam catching a figure standing at the bottom of the stairs. It's a child, or something that looks like one. Its face is pale and featureless, with no eyes, no mouth, just smooth, unbroken skin. It tilts its head as if studying him. Elliot stumbles backward, crashing into the workbench. Tools clatter to the floor. Stay away, he shouts, brandishing the flashlight like a weapon. The figure takes a step forward. Its movements are jerky, unnatural, as though it's being controlled by invisible strings. Elliot scrambles for the stairs, his heart pounding. The figure doesn't follow but tilts its head again as if curious. As he reaches the top of the stairs, he dares to glance back. The basement is empty. The doll is gone. He slams the door shut, leaning against it as his chest heaves. His mind races, trying to make sense of what he's seen. The house groans, the sound deep and resonant, like a massive exhale. From somewhere above, a voice calls out, a woman's voice, soft and familiar. Elliot? His blood runs cold. "Marla," he whispers the word barely audible. The voice comes again, clearer this time. "Elliot, help me." He grips the flashlight tightly, his legs trembling beneath him. "Marla, is that you?" The voice doesn't respond, but the sound of footsteps echoes from the upper floor, light and deliberate. Elliot swallows hard, his fear warring with a flicker of hope. If Marla is here, maybe this nightmare can end. He forces himself toward the staircase, the flashlight beam leading the way. The house seems to shift around him, the walls narrowing, the air growing colder. As he ascends, the voice becomes more distant, as though retreating further into the house. "Marla," he calls, desperation creeping into his voice. The top of the stairs opens into a long hallway. The doors on either side are closed, their paint peeling and their brass handles tarnished. The last door at the end of the hall stands ajar, a faint light spilling out. Elliot moves toward it, his footsteps muffled on the threadbare carpet. The light flickers like a dying candle. "Marla?" He pushes the door open. Inside, the room is empty. The light comes from an old oil lamp sitting on a small wooden table in the center. The flame sputters, casting jittery shadows on the walls. On the table rests a photograph. Elliot approaches cautiously, his fingers hovering over the frame. It's a picture of him and Marla as children, standing in front of Grimwood House. They're smiling, but something about the photo is wrong. The house behind them looks alive. Its windows like eyes, its door a gaping mouth. And in the corner of the photo, barely visible, stands a figure cloaked in shadow. Elliot's breath catches in his throat. The shadowed figure seems to shift within the frame, its head tilting toward him. The flame of the lamp flares suddenly, bathing the room in blinding light. A voice, deep and guttural, growls from everywhere at once. "Leave." The light dies. The darkness swallows Elliot whole. His breath comes in sharp gasps, his pulse hammering in his ears. The room is dead silent, but he feels it, something watching, something waiting. He fumbles with the flashlight, his hands slick with sweat. When it finally flickers on, the beam reveals the photograph again. But now the image has changed. Marla is gone. The young Elliot stands alone in front of Grimwood House, his face twisted into a blank, unnatural grin. The shadowy figure in the background is closer, looming over him with a hand extended toward his shoulder. "No," Elliot mutters, stumbling back. "This isn't real." The photograph disintegrates into ash before his eyes, crumbling into nothing on the table. From behind him, the floorboards creak. He spins around, the flashlight beam slicing through the shadows. The hallway is empty, but the air feels alive with movement. "Marla," he shouts, his voice cracking. "If you're here, say something." A faint whisper answers, drifting through the corridor. "Elliot, this way." He steps into the hallway, the whisper leading him like a ghostly thread. The doors on either side seem to loom closer, their tarnished brass knobs gleaming faintly in the flickering light. The whisper grows louder, more urgent. "Elliot, hurry." He breaks into a jog, the flashlight bouncing wildly. The hallway seems to stretch endlessly, each step pulling him further from any sense of reality. Finally, he reaches the last door. It's ajar, the faint scent of lavender wafting through the crack. He hesitates, his hand trembling as it touches the doorknob. "Marla?" The door creaks open, revealing a bedroom frozen in time. The wallpaper is faded but floral, the furniture covered in thick layers of dust. A four-poster bed sits against the far wall, its canopy torn and sagging. In the center of the room, a vanity mirror gleams, untouched by age or decay. Elliot steps inside, the flashlight sweeping across the room. The whispers have stopped, replaced by an oppressive silence. On the vanity, a music box sits open, its porcelain ballerina poised mid-spin. He approaches cautiously. The flashlight catches something in the mirror, a flicker of movement too fast to track. He freezes, his eyes locked on his reflection. Behind him, a figure stands in the shadows, tall and gaunt. Its face is obscured, but its presence radiates malice. Elliot whirls around, the flashlight beam illuminating nothing but an empty room. When he turns back to the mirror, his reflection is gone. What the hell? The music box springs to life, its haunting melody filling the room. The ballerina begins to spin, her movements jerky and unnatural. Elliot backs away, the melody growing louder and more discordant. "Stop it," he shouts, slamming the lid shut. The music stops abruptly and the room falls silent. The mirror cracks. A voice, low, gravelly, and inhuman, rumbles from the shadows. "You don't belong here." Elliot stumbles backward, tripping over the edge of the bed. The flashlight clatters to the floor, its beam cutting wildly across the room. The air grows colder, and the figure from the mirror emerges from the shadows. Its form is indistinct, shrouded in darkness that seems to writhe and twist. Elliot scrambles to his feet, grabbing the flashlight. He points it at the figure, but the light seems to bend around it, leaving it untouched. "Stay away," he yells, his voice trembling. The figure doesn't move, but its presence fills the room, suffocating and unrelenting. "You came here," it says, its voice reverberating in Elliot's skull. "You woke the house." "I didn't mean to," Elliot stammers. "I was just looking for answers." The figure tilts its head as if considering his words. "The house remembers," it says. "It remembers you." Elliot's blood runs cold. "What do you mean? I've never been here before." The figure steps closer, its shadow stretching toward him. "You don't remember," it hisses. "But it remembers you." Images flash through Elliot's mind, fragments of memories he can't place. A child's laughter. A woman's scream. The sound of shattering glass. The figure raises a hand, long and clawed, and points to the vanity mirror. "Look," it commands. Elliot hesitates, his heart pounding. Slowly he turns toward the mirror. In the fractured glass, a scene unfolds. A young boy, himself, running through the halls of Grimwood House. He looks terrified, glancing over his shoulder as if something chases him. Behind the boy, the same shadowy figure looms, its claws reaching for him. The image shifts. The boy hides beneath a table, clutching a music box. The figure prowls the room, searching, its movements deliberate and predatory. The scene fades and Elliot's reflection returns. The figure steps closer, its voice a whisper in his ear. "You escaped once. You won't escape again." Elliot bolts for the door, his flashlight swinging wildly. He doesn't look back as he tears down the hallway, the house groaning and shuddering around him. The whispers return, louder and more frantic. "Elliot, Elliot, don't leave." The staircase comes into view and he takes the steps two at a time, nearly tripping in his haste. The front door looms ahead, a beacon of salvation. But when he reaches it, the door won't budge. "Come on," he shouts, yanking at the handle. The house laughs, a deep, guttural sound that vibrates through the walls. "You woke the house," the voice echoes. "And now you're part of it." The shadows in the room grow deeper, stretching toward him like grasping hands. Elliot screams, slamming his shoulder against the door with all his strength. It bursts open and he stumbles into the night, the cold air hitting him like a wave. He collapses on the ground, gasping for breath. Behind him, Grimwood House stands silent and still, its windows dark and lifeless. But as he stares at it, something shifts. A shadow moves behind one of the upper windows, watching him. Elliot doesn't wait to see more. He scrambles to his feet and runs, the house's laughter echoing in his ears. Elliot runs blindly, his footsteps pounding against the overgrown path leading away from Grimwood House. The cold night air bites at his skin, but he doesn't stop. His breath comes in ragged gasps, his heart hammering in his chest. The forest around him feels alive. Branches scrape against one another, whispering secrets he can't hear. Shadows dart in the corners of his vision, too quick and fleeting to catch. Finally, his legs give out. He collapses to the ground, his knees sinking into the damp earth. He glances back toward the house. Through the tangled trees, its silhouette looms, dark and imposing. The windows are lifeless now, but he can still feel it watching him. Elliot grips the flashlight tightly, though its beam has grown faint. "What is this place?" he mutters, his voice barely audible over the sound of his own breathing. The answer comes not in words but in a sensation, a pull. Something tugs at the edges of his mind, urging him deeper into the forest. "No," he says, shaking his head as if to dislodge the feeling. "I'm not going back." But the pull grows stronger, insistent. He stands on shaky legs, his body moving almost against his will. The path ahead seems to open for him, the trees parting to reveal a narrow trail shrouded in mist. The flashlight flickers again. He slaps it, muttering a curse under his breath. The faint beam reveals footprints in the dirt, small, delicate, like a child's. "Marla?" he whispers, the name escaping his lips before he can stop it. The forest answers with silence. The pull intensifies and Elliot finds himself following the trail, his feet crunching softly against the undergrowth. The deeper he goes, the colder it becomes. The trees seem to lean closer, their gnarled branches reaching for him like skeletal hands. He stumbles into a clearing, the mist curling around his ankles. At its center stands a massive oak tree, its twisted branches spreading wide like a web. The pull draws him to the base of the tree, where the ground is unnaturally bare, the dirt blackened and cracked. A single object lies there, a porcelain doll, its face cracked and its eyes staring blankly. It's the same doll from the basement. Elliot's breath catches in his throat. He kneels slowly, his fingers hovering over the doll. A voice whispers from the shadows, soft and childlike. "Don't leave me, Elliot." His heart pounds as he looks around, the flashlight beam slicing through the mist. "Marla? Is that you?" The voice comes again, closer now. "Don't leave me, please." He grabs the doll, the porcelain cold and rough against his skin. The ground beneath him trembles, a low rumble spreading through the clearing. The oak tree groans, its branches creaking as if alive. Elliot scrambles back, clutching the doll to his chest. The rumbling grows louder, the earth splitting open at the base of the tree. From the darkness below, a figure rises, a woman, her face obscured by a tangle of black hair. "Marla?" Elliot whispers, his voice trembling. The figure steps forward, her movements slow and deliberate. When she looks up, her face is pale and lifeless, her eyes hollow voids. "Why did you leave me?" she asks, her voice echoing unnaturally. Elliot stumbles to his feet, the doll slipping from his grasp. I didn't mean to." The figure tilts her head, her expression unreadable. "You left us, Elliot. You left us to him." "Who?" he asks, his voice breaking. "Who did I leave you to?" Her hollow eyes fix on him, and the shadows around her seem to grow darker, heavier. "The Watcher," she says. "The Hollow claimed us. And now it will claim you." The clearing erupts in chaos. The oak tree's branches lash out, the mist swirling into a frenzy. The ground beneath Elliot's feet shifts, pulling him toward the chasm at the tree's base. He fights against the pull, grabbing at roots and rocks. "No, I won't let this happen." The woman's voice rises above the cacophony, filled with pain and anger. "You can't escape, Elliot. You belong to the Hollow now." The shadows surge toward him, and he screams, his voice lost in the howling wind. In a desperate move, he grabs the doll again, holding it out like a shield. The shadows hesitate, recoiling slightly. "Leave me alone," he shouts, his voice raw. The woman's form flickers, her features distorting. For a brief moment, her face becomes Marla's, young, terrified, and pleading. "Help me," she whispers. The shadows surge forward again, and Elliot feels himself being dragged toward the chasm. His grip on the doll tightens, his knuckles white. As the darkness closes in, the flashlight sputters one final time and dies, leaving him in total darkness. And then, silence. When Elliot opens his eyes, he's lying on the ground, the porcelain doll cradled in his arms. The clearing is gone, replaced by the overgrown path leading back to Grimwood House. The pull is gone, but the weight of the encounter lingers, heavy and suffocating. In the distance, the house looms, its windows glowing faintly with an unnatural light. Elliot rises slowly, his legs unsteady. He knows now that there's no escape. Not until he faces the truth buried within Grimwood House. Elliot's feet drag as he approaches Grimwood House, its looming silhouette outlined against the overcast sky. The light in the windows flickers as if the house is alive, breathing. The porcelain doll is tucked under his arm. He doesn't want to hold it, but letting it go feels impossible. It's an anchor now, a tether to the haunting echoes of the past. The front door groans open before he touches it, the sound like a deep exhale. He hesitates on the threshold, staring into the dimly lit corridor. "I have to do this," he mutters, steeling himself. The air inside is thick, stale, and cold. The walls seem closer than before, the shadows deeper. His footsteps echo unnaturally, each step reverberating as if the house is mocking him. He makes his way to the grand staircase, gripping the railing. The wood is damp and sticky, leaving a residue on his palm. As he ascends, whispers rise from the walls, soft, indistinct murmurs that grow louder with each step. "Elliot, why did you leave us?" He stops midway, his chest tightening. "Who are you?" he demands, his voice cracking. The whispers pause, replaced by faint laughter, high-pitched and eerie. "Don't you remember?" The porcelain doll slips from under his arm and clatters to the floor. He watches in horror as it rolls to the bottom of the stairs, coming to rest upright, its cracked face staring back at him. "Come back," the whispers urge. "No," Elliot says through gritted teeth, forcing himself to keep climbing. The second floor is worse. The wallpaper is peeling in long, jagged strips, revealing dark stains beneath. The floorboards creak under his weight, each step a groan of protest. At the end of the hallway, a door stands ajar. A faint glow seeps through the crack, pulsing like a heartbeat. He moves toward it, his steps slow and deliberate. The whispers follow him, growing louder and more accusatory. "You left us to die, you let him take us." He pushes the door open, revealing a small bedroom bathed in an unnatural red light. The walls are covered in writing, words scrawled in jagged, overlapping lines. Elliot steps closer, squinting to make sense of them. It's his name, repeated over and over in various sizes and slants. Some of the letters drip as if freshly carved into the plaster. In the center of the room, a small figure sits on the floor, hunched over something in its lap. Marla? Elliot whispers, his voice barely audible. The figure doesn't move. He steps closer, his heart pounding. The figure's shoulders tremble, a soft sobbing sound filling the room. Marla, he says again, kneeling beside her. It's me. I'm here. She lifts her head slowly, turning to face him. It's not Marla. The figure's face is pale and hollow, her eyes two deep voids that seem to pull at his very soul. Her mouth twists into a grotesque grin, her teeth jagged and yellowed. You left us, she says, her voice an unnatural mix of childlike innocence and guttural rage. Elliot stumbles back, falling against the wall. The scrawled writing seems to ripple, the letters twisting into grotesque shapes. I didn't mean to, he shouts. I don't even remember. Liar, she hisses, rising to her feet. Her movements are jerky and unnatural, her head tilting at an impossible angle. The room begins to shake, the walls groaning as if in pain. The red light grows brighter, blinding. Elliot covers his face, the air thick with heat and the stench of decay. And then, silence. When he looks up, the room is empty. The writing is gone, the walls bare and cracked. But something has changed. The whispers have stopped, replaced by a deep, rhythmic thumping, a heartbeat, slow and deliberate. It's coming from beneath him. He stares at the floor, his pulse quickening. The boards seem to move slightly with each thump, as if the house itself has a pulse. Get out, a voice growls, low and guttural. The floor beneath him collapses and he plunges into darkness. Elliot lands hard, the impact knocking the air from his lungs. The flashlight flickers back to life, its beam revealing a long, narrow tunnel. The walls are rough stone, damp and covered in thick, glistening moss. The heartbeat is louder here, echoing through the confined space. He pushes himself to his feet, his body aching. The tunnel stretches ahead, its end shrouded in shadows. He doesn't want to go forward, but something compels him, a mix of dread and grim determination. The deeper he goes, the louder the heartbeat becomes. It seems to sync with his own, each thump reverberating through his chest. The tunnel opens into a cavernous chamber, its walls lined with grotesque carvings. Figures twist and writhe in the stone, their faces frozen in expressions of agony. At the center of the chamber stands a stone altar, cracked and weathered. On the altar lies a book, its cover black and pulsing faintly with each heartbeat. Elliot approaches cautiously, his flashlight trembling in his hand. The carvings seem to move in his peripheral vision, their tortured forms reaching out to him. He reaches the altar and hesitates, staring at the book. It feels alive, radiating an oppressive energy. You're not supposed to be here, a voice growls from behind him. He spins around, the flashlight beam landing on a figure shrouded in shadow. Its eyes glow faintly, piercing the darkness. What is this place? Elliot demands, his voice shaking. The figure steps closer, its form shifting and indistinct. This is where it began, it says. Where it always begins. Elliot's grip tightens on the flashlight. What do you mean? The figure gestures to the book. The hollow calls to you, Elliot. It always has. The watcher waits. The heartbeat grows deafening, the chamber trembling. The book seems to pulse faster, its energy pulling at Elliot. I don't understand, he says, his voice barely audible over the noise. The figure tilts its head, its glowing eyes narrowing. You will? The shadows surge forward, enveloping Elliot in darkness. Elliot wakes gasping for air, his chest heaving as though he's been submerged in ice water. The darkness is absolute, oppressive, and alive with faint, guttural whispers. His flashlight lies beside him, cracked but still emitting a faint, flickering beam. He reaches for it with trembling fingers, his pulse racing. The beam illuminates a stone chamber, different from the one with the altar. The air here is colder, the walls slick with moisture. Strange symbols are etched into the stone, faintly glowing in an unnatural green hue. Where am I? He whispers, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. A slow, deliberate thump answers him. The heartbeat. It's louder now, resonating through the walls and his very bones. Elliot pulls himself to his feet, the flashlight beam trembling as he sweeps it across the chamber. The symbols writhe and twist as if alive, their glowing lines forming shapes that vanish before his eyes can focus on them. He spots a narrow tunnel ahead, the sound of the heartbeat emanating from its depths. This isn't real, he mutters, but his feet move forward anyway. The tunnel seems to stretch endlessly, the walls closing in with each step. The heartbeat grows louder, faster, matching the frantic rhythm of his own pulse. And then he hears it, a low, raspy breathing. He freezes, the flashlight beam flickering against the darkness ahead. "Who's there?" he calls, his voice cracking. The breathing stops. In the silence, a soft scraping sound echoes, like nails dragging across stone. "Turn back." The voice is deep, inhuman, and filled with malice. Elliot's grip tightens on the flashlight. "I can't. I need to know the truth." The tunnel shakes, loose stones tumbling from the walls. The voice laughs, a sound that chills him to his core. "You think you seek the truth?" it says. "Foolish child. You seek your doom." The scraping sound grows louder, closer. Elliot's flashlight flickers wildly, casting erratic shadows along the tunnel walls. And then he sees it. A figure emerges from the darkness, impossibly tall and grotesquely thin. Its limbs are elongated, its hands ending in razor-sharp claws. Its face is obscured by a swirling mass of shadows, but its eyes burn with a sickly yellow light. Elliot stumbles back, his breath catching in his throat. The Watcher. The creature tilts its head, its movements unnervingly slow. "You remember," it says, its voice reverberating through the tunnel. "I don't," Elliot begins, but the memories flood back before he can finish. He sees flashes of a younger version of himself standing in the same chamber, the altar before him. Marla is there too, her face pale and frightened. And the book, the black pulsing book, open between them. "You were chosen," the Watcher says, its voice dragging Elliot back to the present. "But you ran." "No," Elliot whispers, shaking his head. "That's not true. I wouldn't." "You left her," the Watcher hisses, stepping closer. "You left them all." The heartbeat is deafening now, each thump a hammer blow against Elliot's skull. "I didn't mean to," he says, his voice breaking. The Watcher laughs again, the sound filled with cruel delight. "Intent does not matter. The hollow marked you. It claimed her. And now it will claim you." Elliot scrambles back, the flashlight flickering out completely. The darkness is absolute, swallowing him whole. The Watcher's voice echoes around him, disorienting and suffocating. "You cannot escape. You belong to me." Elliot's eyes snap open, his body jolting upright. He's no longer in the tunnel. He's back in Grimwood House, lying on the cold, rotting floor of the foyer. The porcelain doll sits beside him, its cracked face turned toward him. For a moment he wonders if it was all a dream. But the heartbeat remains, faint now but ever present. He stands unsteady on his feet. The house feels different, heavier, darker. The walls seem to close in around him, and the air is thick with an oppressive energy. The whispers return, faint and mocking. "You cannot run, cannot hide." Elliot grips the doll tightly, his knuckles white. He knows he can't leave, not yet. The Watcher is still here waiting. He moves toward the staircase, the floor groaning beneath him. The whispers grow louder, filling his head with a cacophony of voices. "Why did you leave us, Elliot? Why?" "I didn't mean to," he shouts, his voice echoing through the empty house. The whispers fall silent. A single voice speaks, clear and cold. "Then prove it." Elliot turns toward the sound, his heart pounding. At the base of the staircase stands a figure, a young girl, her face pale and her eyes filled with sorrow. "Marla?" She doesn't respond, only turns and begins to ascend the stairs. "Wait," Elliot calls, following her. She leads him to the second floor, down the hallway to the door that had been ajar before. This time it is wide open, revealing the bedroom bathed in red light. Marla stands at the center of the room, her back to him. "I'm sorry," Elliot says, his voice trembling. She turns slowly, her expression unreadable. "It's not enough," she says softly. Before he can respond, the walls of the room begin to ripple, the red light intensifying. The symbols scrawled across the walls reappear, glowing brighter than before. The heartbeat returns, loud and relentless. The Watcher's voice fills the room, low and menacing. "Prove yourself, Elliot. Face the hollow, or fall." The floor beneath him cracks, splitting open to reveal the chasm below. Marla reaches out to him, her hand trembling. "Save me," she whispers, tears streaming down her face. Elliot lunges for her, but the ground gives way, and they both plunge into the darkness. Elliot's body crashes to the cold stone floor. His limbs ache, his head spinning, but the darkness is suffocating, swallowing him whole. For a moment he's unsure if he's even still alive. The weight of the void presses against him, the sound of his breath the only thing that grounds him. "Marla," he calls out, his voice breaking the silence. His chest tightens, the air thick with dread. But there's no answer. Only the faint echo of his own voice, swallowed by the blackness. The heartbeat pounds in his ears, each thump like a drum, growing louder, closer. He's not alone. Elliot scrambles to his feet, the stone beneath him cold and uneven. His hands are shaking as he reaches for his flashlight, but it's gone, lost in the fall. The shadows around him shift, twisting like tendrils of smoke, and for the briefest moment he sees something move, something large, something monstrous. A figure? No, just the darkness itself. "Where are you?" he whispers, his voice lost in the void. "I'm not leaving without you." The heartbeat quickens, matching his pulse. A low growl rumbles through the air. It comes from somewhere deep below, an almost animalistic sound, thick with hunger. "Marla," Elliot mutters again, his throat dry. His feet are unsteady as he stumbles forward, following the sound of the heartbeat. He pushes through the darkness, his mind a whirl of confusion and fear. The passage around him feels endless, twisting, turning, spiraling downward. He doesn't know how long he's been walking, or if he's even still heading in the right direction. And then he sees it. A dim light flickers ahead. It's faint, but it's enough to push him forward. His heart pounds in his chest as he moves toward it, each step heavier than the last. The light grows brighter, and soon he sees the source, an enormous stone archway, its edges glowing with a sickly green light. The ground beneath his feet changes. The stone gives way to soft, damp earth, and the air feels heavier, thick with moisture. The heartbeat is louder now, deafening, coming from somewhere beyond the archway. "Marla?" he calls again, his voice hoarse and desperate. But as he steps through the arch, the world around him shifts. The air is dense, thick with a palpable sense of malice. He's in a forest now, though it's not like any forest he's ever seen. The trees are impossibly tall, their bark dark and twisted. The canopy above is choked with thick black vines that block out the sky. There's no wind, no sound, only the beat of the hollow pulsing through the ground beneath his feet. The forest feels alive, watching him, judging him. And then he hears it. A voice. Elliot. His name, whispered on the wind, a cold, familiar sound that sends a shiver down his spine. He spins around, but there's no one there. The voice echoes again, closer this time, as if it's coming from all directions at once. "Elliot, you can't escape." His breath catches in his throat and he backs away, his pulse racing. He turns, but the forest has changed. The trees closer now, their branches reaching out like fingers. The path he's on is gone, swallowed by the twisting undergrowth. He's lost. The heartbeat is louder, closer, pounding in time with his frantic pulse. "Help me," a voice pleads from the shadows. It's Marla's voice. Elliot stumbles forward, desperate, his legs heavy as though they're being dragged through the earth itself. The trees seem to close in around him, their twisted branches snaring his clothes, pulling him back. "Marla." But she doesn't answer. Only the sound of the heartbeat. And then he sees it. A figure standing in the distance. Tall, cloaked in shadow, its outline twisted and shifting. Its eyes glow faintly in the darkness, yellow, burning. The Watcher. Elliot's breath catches in his throat as he stares at the creature, frozen in place by its presence. It's not just a figure, it's a manifestation of the hollow itself, the embodiment of the darkness that has been chasing him since he stepped foot in Grimwood House. It raises one long, clawed hand, pointing toward him. The air around him grows heavier, pressing against him, suffocating him. "You shouldn't have come back," the Watcher growls, its voice a guttural rasp that sends chills down Elliot's spine. Elliot can't move. His legs won't obey him. He can feel the weight of the hollow pulling him down, the ground beneath him soft and unsteady, as though he's sinking into it. "You were always meant to return," the Watcher continues, its voice growing louder. The hollow never forgets. A cold wind howls through the trees, sending a shiver down Elliot's spine. He looks around, searching for an escape, but the forest is endless, a maze of twisted trees and shadows. "Marla," he shouts again, his voice desperate. "Where are you?" The Watcher laughs, a low, terrifying sound that rattles through him. "You will never find her," it says. "Not in this place. Not in the hollow." Elliot shakes his head, panic rising in his chest. He can feel the ground beneath him shifting, the darkness closing in. He has to get out. He has to save her. But the Watcher takes a step forward, its figure growing larger, more monstrous. The trees bend around it, their trunks cracking like dry wood. "Too late," the Watcher says. The hollow takes what it wants. And then the forest begins to move. The trees twist, their limbs reaching out, their roots breaking through the ground. The path disappears beneath Elliot's feet, the world around him collapsing into darkness. The heartbeat is deafening now, a pounding rhythm that threatens to crush him. Elliot screams, but his voice is swallowed by the overwhelming noise. He stumbles forward, falling to his knees as the darkness swallows him whole. And then a hand grabs his arm, cold, brittle fingers that burn against his skin. He looks up, his heart stopping in his chest. It's Marla. Her face is pale, her eyes wide with terror, but she doesn't speak. She only pulls him into the darkness. Marla, he cries out, his hand reaching for her, but she's gone, swallowed by the void. And the heartbeat, it's louder now. Louder than his own heartbeat. Louder than anything else. Elliot knows, he knows, that it's the end. Elliot's vision blurs as the darkness closes in around him. His breath comes in ragged gasps, chest rising and falling in panic. His heart pounds, louder than the ever-present thrum of the hollow. The ground beneath him quakes as if the very earth is alive, hungry. His skin prickles, the air thick and suffocating, drowning him in its oppressive weight. The hand, cold, clammy fingers, clutches his arm, dragging him through the blackened void. His body is no longer his own, suspended in this nightmare. Every step feels like he's being pulled deeper into the abyss, further from any sense of safety or hope. Marla, he cries out, his voice raw. The air swallows his words as soon as they leave his mouth, but his heart clenches. She had been there. He had seen her face. But now it's as if she was never real. The darkness stretches before him, endless and hollow, a void that twists and contorts as though it itself is in agony. The air is thick with the sound of the heartbeat, faster now, erratic like the death rattle of the world. And then something shifts. A crack appears in the blackness ahead, a line of faint red light that flickers in the distance. It pulses with a rhythm of its own, alien and terrible. As he stumbles toward it, his foot falls heavy and slow. The darkness behind him seems to shrink, pulling back like a wounded animal retreating into its lair. The heartbeat comes to a stop, and for a brief, maddening second, the world is silent. "Help me," Marla's voice calls, distant and muffled, like an echo of a memory long forgotten. Elliot's heart lurches. The light is closer now, so close he can feel the heat radiating from it. He takes a shaky step forward, his hands outstretched toward it, driven by a primal urge to find her, to end this madness. The light isn't just light, it's a door. A swirling mass of energy, glowing with the same sickly green hue as the symbols etched into the walls of Grimwood House. The same color as the hollow itself. Elliot's breath hitches as he steps closer, his mind reeling, trying to make sense of the vision that pulses before him. His fingers brush the edge of the swirling doorway, and a jolt of electricity shoots through him, searing his skin, making his heart stutter. "Marla," he screams again, voice frantic as he steps into the doorway. The world shifts violently, twisting and tearing like paper in the wind. His body is jerked forward, his head spinning as the ground disappears beneath his feet. He's falling again, faster this time, faster than before. And then he lands. His body crashes against cold stone once more. His skull throbs with the impact, but he barely registers the pain. His eyes snap open. The room around him is dark. No, not dark. It's alive with shadows, shadows that pulse and move like living things, stretching and bending unnaturally, just out of the corner of his vision. His heart races, each beat a hammer against his ribs. The red light from the doorway fades, leaving him in near total darkness. The air smells of decay, of rot, of something far worse than death. And there, standing in front of him, is the source of all of this. The Watcher. It is no longer just a silhouette, no longer just a thing of shadow. Now it is a towering, grotesque presence, its form a twisting mass of shadow and shifting shapes. Its limbs are impossibly long, ending in claws that scrape across the floor, sending sparks of terror through Elliot's veins. But it is its face, the Watcher's face, that freezes him in place. A face that is at once familiar and wrong. It is the face of a man, twisted and contorted, its eyes wide and unblinking, staring directly into Elliot's soul. But the man is not human. The features are warped, melting into the void, a face not quite finished. It is Marla's father. The man who had disappeared all those years ago. The one who had been tied to the curse of Grimwood House. The Watcher smiles, the twisted expression sending waves of dread through Elliot's entire being. "You came back," the Watcher says, its voice reverberating through Elliot's bones. It is not just one voice but a chorus of many, Dozens, hundreds, overlapping and tangled together in a nightmarish symphony. You think you can stop this? That you can undo what was done? Elliot's mind reels. His thoughts spiral, crashing against one another, the truth dawning on him. I didn't know. His voice is weak, barely a whisper. The horror of the truth washes over him, suffocating him. I didn't know it was you. The watcher tilts its head, the motion inhuman, its long neck cracking with an audible snap. You don't remember, it says, its voice heavy with amusement. You were too young. But it doesn't matter now. You've crossed the threshold. There's no turning back. Elliot steps back, his heart hammering. He wants to run, but his feet are rooted to the stone, his body trembling uncontrollably. What do you want from me? He asks, desperation filling his voice. What do you want from all of us? The watcher's smile widens, its teeth sharp and jagged like broken glass. I want you, it says, its voice oozing with malice. You're the key to ending it all. To setting the hollow free. No, Elliot gasps, shaking his head. No, I can't. You already have, the watcher interrupts. The moment you returned, you sealed your fate. The hollow calls to you. You can't escape it. It's inside you, Elliot. It always has been. The floor beneath him rumbles, the stones cracking and shifting as though the earth itself is responding to the watcher's words. A deep, bone-chilling growl emanates from the darkness, growing louder with every passing second. The heartbeat is not just a sound. It's the pulse of the hollow itself, the very heart of the curse that has consumed this place for generations. It is alive. It is sentient. And it is feeding on Elliot's fear. No. Elliot screams, his body seizing as the ground shakes beneath him. I won't be a part of this. I won't. The watcher laughs, low, deep, and mocking. You've already made your choice. You've come too far. Suddenly, the walls of the chamber seem to close in, the shadows twisting around him, the heartbeat deafening. A vision flashes before his eyes. Marla, her face pale and stricken with terror, reaching out to him, her voice pleading, help me. But there is no way to reach her. The hollow's grip tightens around his chest, squeezing the air from his lungs. The watcher steps closer, its towering form casting a long, terrifying shadow across the room. You will become one with the hollow, Elliot, it says, its voice dripping with anticipation. You will join us. You will be the key that opens the door. The ground trembles again and Elliot knows, he knows, there is no escaping this place. The hollow will consume him. It will consume everything. And the watcher will be its master. Elliot's knees buckle beneath him. The weight of the world presses down on his chest, suffocating him. The stone floor beneath him is cold, slick with an unnatural moisture, and his breath comes in shallow gasps. His heart races, a primal instinct to survive fighting against the growing terror that claws at his mind. The watcher looms above him, its twisted, featureless face casting a long shadow that seems to stretch infinitely. The air around Elliot is thick with the scent of decay, the suffocating presence of something ancient and malevolent, something older than time itself. There's no escape, the watcher croons, its voice shifting like a dozen voices speaking at once, a chorus of whispers that makes Elliot's skin crawl. This place, it is the end and it is the beginning. The hollow has waited so long and now, you are its vessel. The words echo in his mind, resonating with an awful truth he refuses to accept. His body feels numb, but his mind is still trapped in a web of panic and confusion. The hollow has waited. Elliot stumbles to his feet, his body trembling, but there's something deeper now. Something darker. The heartbeat. The pulse. It's growing louder, reverberating through his bones. It's no longer just a sound, it's a feeling, an oppressive force that wraps around him, pressing in on all sides. You don't understand, Elliot says, his voice barely a whisper, thick with fear. I didn't choose this. I didn't choose any of this. The watcher tilts its head slowly, its eyes, if they could even be called eyes, glow faintly. A soft, sickly green. It was never your choice. The hollow doesn't ask for permission. It takes what it wants. And it has chosen you. A terrible, twisting sensation fills Elliot's stomach as he tries to comprehend the enormity of what the watcher is saying. His mind races, memories of the past flashing in fragments, Grimwood House, his father's disappearance, the stories about the hollow that he thought were nothing more than local legend. But they weren't stories. They were warnings. The hollow wasn't just a place. It was a living entity, a force. And he had been lured back into its grasp, drawn into its web by something he couldn't even begin to understand. No, Elliot breathes, shaking his head violently. I won't let you control me. I won't. The watcher steps forward, its limbs elongated and twisted, the very air warping around it as it moves. Its clawed fingers stretch toward him, the tips sharp and grotesque, gleaming in the dim light. "You have already been chosen," the Watcher says softly, its voice almost comforting, as if this is inevitable, as if there is no escape. "You belong to the Hollow now. Your blood, your soul, they are ours." The ground rumbles beneath Elliot's feet and he stumbles back, his heart pounding in his chest. The room seems to pulse with life, no, with death. The walls, the floor, the ceiling, all of it seems to breathe in time with the heartbeat. "No," Elliot says again, more forcefully this time, desperation and fear turning into something colder, something darker. He has to fight. He has to find a way out. "I won't be part of this. You hear me? I won't." The Watcher laughs. A low, terrifying sound that rattles through Elliot's bones. "You don't have a choice," it says. "The Hollow does not care for your resistance. It does not care for your fear. It consumes all." A wave of dizziness crashes over him. His head spins. The walls around him begin to distort, stretching and warping as the heartbeat grows louder, more intense. The Watcher's form begins to shift, flickering between its true shape and something far more monstrous. Its face melting, its limbs elongating, twisting in impossible ways. Elliot grips his head, his vision blurring, his mind fracturing under the pressure. The darkness is closing in again, overwhelming him. He can't breathe, can't think. The Hollow is inside him now. He can feel it, its cold fingers creeping into his chest, filling his veins with ice. And then he sees her. Marla. She's standing in the center of the room, her eyes wide with terror, her face pale and ghostly in the dim light. Her clothes are tattered, as though she's been here for far longer than Elliot could have imagined. "Elliot," she whispers, her voice broken, as if she's speaking through a veil. "You have to stop it." Elliot stumbles forward, his hands reaching for her, but she doesn't move. She remains still, a prisoner of the Hollow. "Marla," Elliot cries, his voice filled with panic. "I'll get you out of here." "Oh, you can't," she interrupts, her voice low, trembling. "You don't understand. It's already too late. The Hollow has already taken you. You're part of it now. You." But her words are drowned out by the deafening thrum of the heartbeat. The room shakes violently and the walls collapse inward. The shadows twist and writhe like living creatures, reaching for Elliot, trying to pull him down into the darkness. The Watcher stands at the center of it all, watching, waiting, its terrible gaze fixed on him. "Take her," the Watcher croons, its voice like a blade, cold and unforgiving. "Take her soul as payment for your own." Elliot looks back at Marla, but her face is no longer the same. Her eyes are empty, her mouth agape in an expression of agony, as though she's already been consumed by the Hollow. Her body is limp, floating in the air as if caught in some twisted, invisible current. Elliot's heart cracks. He's too late. "No," he screams, his voice hoarse, his body trembling. "I won't let you take her. I won't let you take anyone." But the Watcher only smiles, its grotesque face contorting into something almost human. "It's too late, Elliot. You've already taken her. And now you will take the rest. The Hollow will consume you all. There is no escaping it. It will never let you go." The walls of the chamber crack and shift, the heartbeat overwhelming his senses. The world begins to dissolve, collapsing into a swirling vortex of darkness, and all Elliot can do is scream. The darkness swallows him whole. Elliot's body is weightless, suspended in a void of endless shadows. There is no sound, no sensation, only the thrum of the Hollow's pulse in the deepest corners of his mind, a constant rhythm that grows louder, more insistent with every passing moment. His limbs feel like they no longer belong to him. His skin tingles with a cold that seeps into his very bones. And then the ground shifts beneath him. Elliot's eyes snap open. He's back in the chamber, the one where he first met the Watcher. But something has changed. The walls, the floor, the very air around him feel different. It's as if the room itself is breathing, alive and pulsing with the heartbeat. The shadows are thicker now, clinging to the corners, swirling like smoke, flickering in and out of existence. But the worst part, the part that claws at his soul, is the absence of Marla. He looks around frantically, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He has to find her. He has to save her. But she's nowhere to be seen. Only the Watcher remains, standing at the far end of the chamber, its twisted, monstrous form casting a long, terrible shadow across the floor. "Where is she?" Elliot demands, his voice shaky but desperate. "Where is Marla?" The Watcher doesn't answer immediately. It simply stands there, its glowing eyes boring into him with a chilling, malevolent gaze. The corners of its mouth twitch upward as if it's savoring his pain. "Where is she?" Elliot repeats, his voice rising. "Tell me, what did you do to her?" The watcher finally speaks, its voice low and unsettling as if it's savoring each word. "She's already part of it. She always has been. The hollow consumes everything, Elliot. Even you." No, Elliot's voice is raw, barely a whisper, but the words are like a blade to his heart. He takes a step forward, but the air around him thickens, pressing against his chest like an invisible weight. "You should have stayed away," the watcher continues, its form shifting and writhing, stretching like molten shadows. "You should have never come back. The hollow was never meant for you to understand. But now you know too much and there is no turning back." The walls of the chamber shudder as the watcher's voice reverberates through the room, each word a cold, twisting reminder of the reality that has trapped him here. Elliot can feel it now, the hollow's pull. It's in his veins, in his mind, in his very soul. He's a part of it, whether he wants to admit it or not. There is no escape, no way out. "I can't," Elliot gasps, his hands shaking. "I can't let this happen." The watcher tilts its head as if studying him, its eyes gleaming with a cruel, predatory intelligence. "You never had a choice, Elliot. The moment you set foot in Grimwood House, you became part of it. And now you will open the door." Elliot's mind reels, confusion clouding his thoughts. "The door?" he echoes. "What door?" "The door to the hollow," the watcher explains, its voice like a cold wind cutting through the silence. "You've already seen it. You've already felt it. It's inside you now. The door will open when you accept what you are, what you've become." "No," Elliot shouts, his voice cracking. "I refuse. I won't let you control me." The watcher's laughter echoes, a sound that chills Elliot to his core. It steps forward, its long limbs gliding unnaturally, its claws scraping the stone floor. The darkness around it seems to shift and writhe as though it's alive, alive with hunger. "You think you have a choice?" the watcher sneers. "The hollow is not just a place. It is a force, a power that exists beyond time and space. It is not something you can fight. It is something you become. And you, Elliot, you are the key." Elliot's mind is in chaos. He wants to fight, to run, to scream. But something is happening inside him, something he can't control. He feels the weight of the hollow's presence pressing down on him, suffocating him, consuming him. The heartbeat grows louder. And then he sees it. At the far end of the room, a crack forms in the wall. At first, it's small, barely noticeable, but it quickly widens, revealing a doorway. No, not just a doorway, but a swirling vortex of light and shadow. It pulses with the same sickly green glow that has haunted him since he first set foot in Grimwood House. The door to the hollow. Elliot steps back, his breath coming in shallow, frantic gasps. The door hums with power, its presence overwhelming, beckoning him toward it. He feels it pulling at him, drawing him closer, but he resists. He has to resist. He can't let it win. He looks at the watcher, his eyes burning with defiance. "I won't open it. I won't let you use me." The watcher's smile widens, revealing rows of jagged, broken teeth. "You don't have a choice. The hollow has already claimed you." The crack in the wall widens further, and the darkness behind the door begins to leak out, swirling like a fog, filling the room with a cold, malevolent presence. The heartbeat pulses faster now, a constant, rhythmic pounding that seems to echo in every corner of his mind. Elliot feels the weight of the hollow pressing down on him. It's inside him, gnawing at his mind, at his very soul. The door is the only way out. The only way to stop this, to end it all. But at what cost? The watcher steps closer, its form towering over him, its eyes gleaming with hunger. "Open the door, Elliot. Let the hollow take its rightful place in this world. Let it consume you." Elliot trembles, the darkness closing in on him. His mind is clouded, his body weak, but something inside him, something deep, something primal, refuses to let go. He clenches his fists, his body shaking with fear and rage. "I will not let you win," he says through gritted teeth. "I will never let you win." The watcher's expression falters for a moment, a flicker of something like doubt crossing its grotesque face. But then it laughs again, the sound low and menacing. "You never had a choice, Elliot," it whispers. "You never had a chance." The darkness swells. The heartbeat accelerates. The door looms in front of him. And for the first time, Elliot feels it, the hollow's final, terrible grip tightening around his soul. The door is before him now, bigger than before, its presence suffocating, like an abyss opening up to consume him whole. Elliot stands frozen, unable to look away. It hums with an unnatural, terrifying energy, beckoning him to step closer, to surrender, to become part of whatever nightmare waits on the other side. The heartbeat grows louder, deafening. The walls of the chamber pulse in time with it, as if they are alive, as if they're feeding off the terrible sound. Each beat is a reminder of his failure, his inevitability. He can feel the hollow in his veins, coursing through him, relentless and cruel. And yet, a small part of him still refuses to surrender. "I won't let you win," Elliot mutters again, the words tasting foreign in his mouth. His body aches, his mind spins, but he forces himself to take a step back from the door. His gaze never wavers from the watcher, whose grotesque face twists into a sneer of satisfaction. The thing knows. It knows what's coming. The watcher's voice cuts through the chaos like a blade. "You think you can resist it, but you are already a part of it. The hollow is not just here. It is within you. You cannot fight what you have become." Elliot's hand trembles at his side, his pulse pounding in his ears, but then, something shifts. A whisper, soft but clear, echoes in his mind. It's not the watcher's voice. It's Marla's. "Elliot." Her voice is faint, distant, but there is something in it. Something familiar. Oh. He clenches his fists, the realization dawning on him. He isn't alone. He never has been. "Find me," Marla's voice urges, like a plea from beyond the veil. Asterisk, you can still stop it. You can still save us. Don't open the door. It's a lie, asterisk. The watcher steps forward, its movements slow and deliberate, as if savoring the moment. "You're too weak to stop it. You're too broken to fight. There is no salvation. The hollow has already claimed you, and it will claim her too." "No?" Elliot screams, but the sound of his own voice is muffled by the pounding of his heart. "I won't let you take her. I won't let you." The door shudders. It pulses, its glowing light flickering, threatening to explode into darkness. And then, in a moment of clarity, Elliot realizes the truth. The hollow isn't just a place, an entity. It's a cycle. It's hunger. And he's the one who has to end it. He can't wait for someone to save him. He can't wait for Marla. The weight of the hollow is too great. It will consume them all if he doesn't act now. The watcher laughs, a low rumbling sound that fills the room, mocking him. "You cannot break free. The hollow is inevitable." With a roar of defiance, Elliot turns from the door, his body moving on instinct. His mind is a storm, chaotic and furious, but he focuses on one thing: Marla. He has to find her. The watcher screeches, its form distorting as it reaches out toward him, but Elliot doesn't hesitate. He charges toward the far wall, where he first saw the crack in reality, the place where everything had started to break. The air around him thickens as he runs, the shadows stretching toward him like fingers desperate to pull him back. But he won't stop. He can't. His hand slams into the stone wall, the cold surface biting into his skin. He feels it, the pulse, the presence of the hollow inside the very foundation of this house, in the stones beneath his fingers. The walls tremble as if alive, as if reacting to his touch. "You are the key," Marla's voice whispers again. Asterisk, break it, Elliot. Destroy the cycle, asterisk. The stone shudders, cracks spreading across its surface. Elliot pushes harder, feeling the force of the hollow fighting back, but he won't give in. He can't. With a final, desperate push, the wall cracks open, a tear in reality itself. The watcher howls in rage behind him, its voice rising to a deafening crescendo. The door to the hollow pulses again, calling to him, but it's too late. Elliot feels a rush of air, a surge of cold, and then darkness. The world falls away. When Elliot opens his eyes, he's no longer in Grimwood House. He's lying on the cold, wet ground, the damp earth pressing into his back. The air is thick, heavy with mist, and the world is quiet, eerily quiet. His breath comes in ragged gasps as he pushes himself up, his hands trembling. The trees around him are old, gnarled, their twisted branches reaching toward a sky that's too dark, too unnatural. The ground is littered with remnants of forgotten things. Old bones, discarded objects, broken fragments of memories. Elliot doesn't understand it. He doesn't know where he is, but he feels something, the presence of something familiar. The hollow is still there, just beyond his reach, waiting. His eyes scan the landscape, and there, at the edge of the clearing, he sees her. Marla. She's standing still, her back to him, her figure pale against the darkened woods. Her presence is like a ghost's, fading in and out of reality, as if she's caught between worlds. Marla. Elliot calls, his voice hoarse. She doesn't turn. She doesn't acknowledge him. He stumbles toward her, his legs weak, but as he reaches out, the mist thickens, swirling around him, swallowing him whole. It's not over yet. The voice of the watcher echoes, distant but clear. Asterisk, you can never escape. The hollow will always find you asterisk. Elliot's heart drops. The mist closes in, choking the air, and he realizes this isn't the end. It's just another beginning. The hollow hasn't let go. Story 2. The headlights of Elliot Grayson's car cut through the fog like a blade, revealing nothing more than the winding, crumbling road ahead. He couldn't remember how long he'd been driving, but the persistent throb of his tired eyes and the eerie quiet of the landscape told him it had been too long. Somewhere deep in the woods, beyond the stretch of civilization, lay the old manor, Grimwood House. It had stood empty for decades, with only rumors keeping it alive. There was no sign of life for miles, except for the occasional caw of a crow or the distant rustle of wind in the trees. The smell of wet earth and rotting leaves filled the air, and the temperature had dropped sharply, seeping into his bones. He could feel the weight of the place before he even saw it, this forgotten, forsaken house. The dread that had started as a small knot in his stomach slowly unraveled into something much more unsettling. Grimwood House had been an assignment, an article he had to write. He had been hired by a local magazine to explore its history, its legacy. But as he drove closer to the manor, Elliot wondered if he had made a mistake. He had been in desperate need of the money. The past few years had been hard. A failed marriage, the death of his mother, and the crumbling of everything he thought he knew had left him with only the raw edge of grief to gnaw on. But he couldn't afford to stay locked in his past, especially now that his career had started slipping. He had to write something that would capture attention, something that could bring him back. The road twisted through an ancient forest, dense and brooding. The trees loomed, their gnarled branches like twisted hands reaching for him. He turned a corner and there it was, Grimwood House. It looked exactly like the kind of place that people talked about in whispers. 3 stories of decaying brick, with ivy crawling up its walls like the fingers of a long-dead hand. The roof sagged in places and some windows were broken, with shards of glass littering the ground beneath. A single, crooked chimney rose from one side of the house, and the whole structure seemed to be sinking slowly into the earth, as though trying to disappear into the very soil. Elliot's heart pounded in his chest as he stopped the car. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of his own breath. He reached for his phone to check for service. Nothing. Of course. He wasn't sure why he expected anything different. Climbing out of the car, Elliot grabbed his flashlight from the glove compartment. The cold air hit him immediately, sending a shiver through his body. He looked up at the house again. It felt like something was watching him, hidden in the shadows behind the darkened windows. There was no turning back now. He had come for a story, and stories were rarely kind. The front door was ajar, as though it had been waiting for him. With a deep breath, he pushed it open and stepped inside. The air inside was thick with dust, and the scent of mildew filled his nostrils. The flashlight beam trembled in his hand as he swept it across the hallway. The walls were covered with faded wallpaper, peeling in places like the skin of an old wound. A staircase loomed in front of him, its banister rotting and unstable. As he walked deeper into the house, a series of low creaks echoed from above. His skin prickled. He stopped listening. Nothing. Just the house settling. Yet something felt off, like a presence just beyond his vision. His pulse quickened and his breath became shallow. It was nothing. He was here to write a story, not to get caught up in ghost tales. But then a soft whisper. It wasn't his imagination. He had heard something. A voice. Low, guttural, just on the edge of hearing. Hello? Elliot's voice cracked as he called out, his words swallowed by the oppressive stillness. No answer. It was probably the wind or the house itself, but Elliot couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was waiting for him in the shadows. He slowly made his way toward the grand staircase, a feeling of foreboding growing heavier with each step. A sudden crash echoed from upstairs as though something had been knocked over. Elliot froze. His mind raced, trying to come up with a rational explanation. A shift in the house's foundation, maybe? Something falling from a shelf? But the rational thought quickly gave way to something darker. The house wasn't just old. It was alive, breathing with the memories of those who had once lived there. And some memories Elliot knew never stayed buried. His heartbeat hammered in his chest as he gripped the flashlight tighter and moved toward the source of the noise. But as he reached the bottom of the stairs, the front door slammed shut with a violent thud. The force of it rattled the walls, and the house groaned like an animal in pain. Elliot's breath caught in his throat. The door had been open when he arrived. Now it was closed and no one had passed him. No one else was here. He wasn't alone. Before he could react, a voice whispered again, louder this time, but it wasn't from above. It was from right behind him. Leave, now. Elliot spun around, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. There was nothing there, no figure, no shadow. Just the empty hallway. But the voice had been real. He could still hear the chill of it in his ears. His pulse raced as the house seemed to close in around him, its oppressive presence almost suffocating. The whispering had stopped, but the weight in the air remained. Elliot looked back toward the staircase. The noise from above had stopped as well. But something was wrong. The door slammed again. This time, it was a soft, reverberating thud, as though something was pressing against it from the other side. The question echoed in his mind. What had he walked into? As Elliot hears the door slam and the oppressive silence fills the air, he feels the presence of something, or someone, closing in on him, forcing him to question if he's just being paranoid or if the house itself is alive and aware of his intrusion. What awaits him in the shadows of Grimwood House? The silence in the house was almost suffocating, broken only by the soft hum of the wind outside and the occasional creak of the old wood. Elliot stood frozen, his breath shallow, trying to calm the panic that was rising in his chest. The door had slammed again, but he couldn't make sense of it. The house was empty. There was no one else here. His mind raced, trying to explain the strange occurrences, but every explanation felt more absurd than the last. He turned his head toward the staircase once more. The beam of his flashlight trembled in his hand as it cut through the thick darkness. There was no sign of movement, no shadow flitting along the walls. Just the oppressive stillness that seemed to hum in the air, a faint eerie whisper that made the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. Taking a deep breath, Elliot forced himself to step forward, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the darkness, revealing the worn, dusty floors and the cracked, fading wallpaper that clung to the walls. His footfalls echoed in the emptiness, each one a reminder that he was alone. Or was he? The house had a way of distorting reality, making it feel like someone or something was always just behind him. The oppressive weight of its age, the years of decay, were more than just physical. They seemed to seep into the very bones of the place. The whispers from before hadn't been his imagination, had they? They had been so real, so clear, as though someone was speaking directly into his ear. He reached the base of the staircase and hesitated for a moment, unsure whether to ascend. The upper floors felt like a trap, dark, empty, and waiting. But there was no escaping it now. He had to see what was at the top of those stairs. He had to prove to himself that it was just his mind playing tricks. There had to be a logical explanation. Gripping the railing, Elliot stepped onto the first step, the wood groaning beneath his weight. Each step was a battle against the rising tide of fear that threatened to overwhelm him. As he ascended, the air grew colder, and the shadows seemed to grow longer, reaching out to him like cold fingers. At the top of the stairs, the hallway stretched out before him like a dark tunnel. The flashlight illuminated the worn, moth-eaten wallpaper and the heavy oak doors that lined the corridor. He had no idea what room he was supposed to be exploring, what part of this place had a story to tell. But the whispers had come from up here, and if there was any truth to the strange feeling gnawing at his gut, it was here that the answers might lie. He moved cautiously down the hall, each step echoing like a drumbeat in the stillness. There were no sounds now, no more whispers, no more creaks. It was as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for him to make a mistake. At the end of the hall, one door stood ajar, a faint light leaking out from the crack. It wasn't much, a dim glow that made the shadows seem more pronounced. Elliot hesitated. This was the moment when he would either find the source of the strange occurrences or confirm that his mind was simply playing tricks on him. He reached for the door, his hand trembling. But just as his fingers brushed the handle, the light flickered, then died completely. The house seemed to exhale a low, creaking groan, as though it was displeased with his presence. Elliot's heart thudded in his chest as he jerked his hand back, the flashlight swinging wildly in his grip. The beam cut across the room, landing on the walls, but there was nothing there. The room was empty, save for dust-covered furniture and the remnants of a past long forgotten. No one had been here for years. Still, the air felt thick with something, an oppressive energy, as though the very walls were watching him. He stepped into the room, his footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. The door behind him creaked shut, but when he turned to look, there was no one there. He froze. It had closed on its own, and he hadn't heard anyone approach. It was as though the house itself had decided to trap him inside. He turned back to the room, his flashlight beam landing on an old rocking chair near the far corner. The chair was still unmoving, but something about it seemed wrong. The way it sat there in the darkness, it was too perfect, too quiet. His throat tightened as his eyes moved slowly across the room. The remnants of a life lived in this place. Old photographs on a dusty mantle, a broken lamp on the floor, seemed to mock him as though the house wanted him to see all of its forgotten ghosts. A low, rasping sound echoed in the corner. Elliot's heart skipped a beat. He swung the flashlight toward the sound, but it was gone as quickly as it had come. The room was still again. He moved cautiously across the floor, closer to the chair, his eyes scanning the shadows. His foot nudged something soft, and he looked down to find an old, worn teddy bear lying on the floor. It was missing an eye, and the fabric was torn in places. But it wasn't the bear that made his blood run cold. It was the feeling that something had once held it, something that hadn't let go. A sudden creak from above made him snap his head up, his flashlight flickering with each shake of his hand. The sound had come from the attic, a place he hadn't yet dared to explore. He had assumed the attic would be empty, abandoned, but now he wasn't so sure. The house had a way of hiding things, of keeping secrets buried until it was ready to reveal them. Elliot stood frozen for a moment, trying to steady his breath. He needed to leave. This was ridiculous star. He had come for a story, but the story was starting to feel like a nightmare. The rational part of his mind screamed at him to turn around, to get in the car and drive away. But the other part of him, the part that still clung to the idea of finding something real, something tangible, pulled him deeper into the house. The whispers returned, faint at first, then growing louder. "Get out before it's too late." The voice seemed to come from everywhere. Inside the walls. Beneath the floorboards. Elliot's pulse quickened and he stepped back, ready to flee. But then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw something moving, something in the shadows of the rocking chair. A figure, pale, gaunt, with hollow eyes, stood there, staring at him with an expression of pure malice. Elliot's breath caught in his throat. The figure didn't move. It didn't speak. Just watched. And then it smiled. A slow, creeping smile that filled Elliot's chest with cold dread. He didn't think. He didn't pause. He ran. As Elliot sees the ghostly figure in the corner, it smiles and he flees in panic. But the house seems to fight back, trapping him with its haunting presence. Is the figure real or just another trick of the mind? And what is lurking in the attic, waiting to be discovered? Elliot's breath was ragged, his pulse thundering in his ears as he stumbled backward through the darkened room. The figure, pale, hollow-eyed, and impossibly still, hadn't moved. It hadn't made a sound. But its presence pressed on him like the weight of 1,000 whispers. He turned and ran, his feet thudding against the old, creaking floors. His flashlight swung wildly in his hand, casting erratic beams of light that illuminated only the shadows, only the empty corners of the house. The room felt like it was closing in on him, the walls narrowing as he bolted down the hallway. But the hallway seemed to stretch endlessly in front of him. The same wallpaper, the same dusty floor, the same doors that all looked the same, like endless mirrors reflecting his panic. His heart raced in his chest, and each breath felt like a battle, his mind screaming at him to escape, to leave, to get away from this place. He reached the top of the stairs, but the house groaned beneath him, as though it were alive, as though it were watching him from every angle. Suddenly, a low, guttural sound echoed from above. A distant scraping noise like fingernails dragging across wood. He froze. His body tensed as he turned, looking back at the darkness at the end of the hall. The scraping continued, rhythmic and deliberate. He couldn't see what was causing it, but it was getting closer. His legs felt like lead as he turned to face the stairs again. The panic was overwhelming, but he couldn't stand still. He couldn't breathe. He had to get out. He had to escape. The first step creaked under his weight, and his hand shot out to grab the banister. But the moment his fingers touched the wood, the house shuddered. It was as if something deep within its bones had woken up. A heavy thud shook the floor beneath him, the kind of noise that rumbled up from the very foundations of the house. Elliot froze, eyes wide. What the hell was that? The scraping noise stopped, replaced by the sound of a door opening somewhere above him. It was a slow, agonizing sound, like something reluctant to let go. Elliot's mind raced, his breath quickening as he spun around, but all he saw was the same hallway, the same silence. He turned back to the stairs, his foot moving to step down, but a sound from behind him made him freeze once more. It wasn't the house settling. It was something else. Someone else. A whisper, low and urgent, came from somewhere just behind his shoulder. Don't look back, Elliot's heart skipped a beat. The voice was unmistakable. It was the same voice he had heard earlier, the one that had warned him to leave. But the moment he turned to look, the house seemed to shift again. The door to the room he had just fled from slammed open with a violent force, the wind howling through the hallway. His flashlight flickered in his hand as the temperature seemed to drop. His breath formed a cloud in the air. Something in the doorway shifted. Was the figure. The same pale, gaunt figure with hollow eyes, standing in the threshold, its head tilted unnaturally to one side. A slow, mocking smile spread across its face, revealing yellowed teeth. And then it spoke, its voice a rasping, broken thing. Asterisk, it's already too late, asterisk. Elliot's blood ran cold as the figure began to move toward him, slow and deliberate, its feet gliding across the floor as though it were floating. The house seemed to hold its breath as the figure approached, its hollow eyes never leaving Elliot's face. His mind screamed at him to run, but his feet wouldn't obey. He was rooted to the spot, his body frozen in place as if the house itself was pulling him deeper into its grip. The figure's smile widened, its eyes darkening with a hunger that chilled Elliot to the core. It stopped just inches away, the coldness of its presence seeping into his skin. Elliot's throat tightened, but he couldn't make a sound. Asterisk, you shouldn't have come here, asterisk, the figure whispered, its voice soft and chilling. Asterisk, this place is hungry and it feeds on fear. And now it has you, asterisk. A sudden rush of sound filled his ears, like wind, but it wasn't wind. It was something darker, something deeper, something that had been waiting for him. The house seemed to moan in response, a sound so ancient and full of suffering that it shook Elliot to his core. His vision blurred as the walls seemed to pulse, to throb like a living thing, and he stumbled back, desperate to get away. But before he could react, the figure's hand shot out, grabbing his wrist with an unnatural strength. Its fingers dug into his skin, ice cold and unyielding. Elliot gasped, trying to pull away, but the grip tightened, and with it, a surge of nausea hit him. The world spun around him, and the floor seemed to give way beneath him. He opened his mouth to scream, but the words died in his throat. A strange force seemed to press down on his chest, making it impossible to breathe. The house had come alive. The walls closed in, the shadows stretching like dark tendrils toward him. And then, just as quickly as it had started, the grip loosened. The figure stepped back, its smile lingering, its eyes gleaming with a malevolent hunger. Elliot gasped for air, his chest heaving as the room returned to its eerie stillness. He stumbled backward, feeling the weight of the house pressing down on him, suffocating him. But the figure was gone. He was alone again, standing in the middle of the hall. The temperature had returned to normal, and the oppressive air seemed to lift for a moment. But Elliot knew it wasn't over. It had only just begun. The sound of scraping returned, faint at first but growing louder, closer. The voice from earlier whispered again, urgent and panicked. Asterisk, get out now. Before it's too late, asterisk. Elliot turned and ran, his legs shaking, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't know where he was going, but he couldn't stay here. The house was alive, and it was closing in on him. He had to escape. But the house was changing, shifting around him, and with every step, it felt like the walls were pulling him deeper into its cold, suffocating embrace. As he reached the top of the stairs, he heard a faint sound behind him. Footsteps, slow and deliberate. Someone, or something, was following him. He looked over his shoulder, his flashlight beam catching a shadow at the edge of the hall. Was there again. The figure. Watching. Elliot is stalked by the figure, which warns him of the house's hunger. As he races to escape, he hears footsteps following him, and the house shifts around him. With every passing moment, the house seems to close in tighter, pulling him deeper into its grasp. Will he escape, or is he already lost to the darkness? Asterisk. The stairs creaked beneath Elliot's feet as he raced downward, the sound of his hurried footsteps a loud contrast to the suffocating silence that gripped the house. His pulse thundered in his ears, a constant reminder that something, someone, was close behind him. The figure, with its hollow eyes and sinister smile, was no longer visible, but the suffocating sense of dread that had settled into his bones told him it wasn't gone. It was waiting. He reached the bottom of the stairs, his heart hammering against his ribs as he turned to scan the room. The front door was right there, just a few paces away, a promise of escape, of freedom. But something felt wrong. The air in the foyer was thick and heavy, pressing in on him. The shadows seemed deeper, more oppressive, and the house groaned as if it were alive, responding to his every movement. He could hear it now, the faintest of whispers, coming from somewhere deep within the walls, low and unintelligible. It was like a distant murmur just on the edge of hearing, but it felt wrong, as if the walls themselves were speaking, calling out to him, begging him to listen. Don't listen, Elliot muttered to himself, shaking his head in a vain attempt to shake off the overwhelming paranoia. It's just the house. It's just the wind, But the whispers were growing louder. They weren't the soft rustle of wind through the cracks. No, these were voices. Several voices, overlapping, murmuring in a language that felt familiar yet foreign. He could hear his name in the cacophony. His name stretched and twisted into something unrecognizable. Elliot. Elliot. It was enough to make him freeze in place, his breath caught in his throat. His mind screamed at him to run, to push through the door and never look back. But something was holding him in place, something invisible that was chaining him to this cursed house. The whispers, they were coming from everywhere now, from the walls, the ceiling, the floor beneath his feet. They seemed to reverberate through the very air. He turned toward the front door again, taking a hesitant step forward. I can make it, just a few more steps, he told himself. He reached out for the door handle, but as his fingers brushed against it, the temperature around him plummeted, the air turning icy cold. The whispering intensified, now a frantic buzzing in his ears, louder and more insistent. Suddenly, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang, making him stumble back, his heart racing in his chest. The house didn't want him to leave. Elliot stood there for a moment, wide-eyed, paralyzed with fear. The house had just trapped him in. The walls felt as though they were closing in, the very foundation of the place shifting beneath his feet. The whispers grew louder, and now they weren't just whispers. They were words, broken, frantic words that seemed to claw at his sanity. Leave, before it finds you, it's already watching. You can't escape, The last whisper, you should never have come, was so loud and clear that it felt as if the voice was right beside him. He spun around, but the room was empty. It was just the house, he told himself again. This is just a bad dream. A nightmare I can't wake up from, But deep down he knew that wasn't true. This was no nightmare. This was real. The house was alive, and it wasn't going to let him go. Frantically, Elliot turned toward the hallway, his eyes scanning for any way out. He had to get out of this house. He had to leave before whatever was in here found him. But then he heard it. A soft, eerie scraping sound from above, like nails dragging against the floorboards. It was slow and deliberate, as though whatever was making it was savoring each movement. It was coming from the attic. Elliot froze, a shiver running down his spine. He had thought about the attic before, the place where the house had seemed to breathe, where the strange energy had pulsed. But he hadn't dared to go up there. He had felt it, the dark presence, the danger. But now it felt like he had no choice. The whispering, the footsteps, the scraping, all of it was leading him toward the attic. No more running. The house wasn't going to let him leave until he faced whatever it was that lived here, whatever malevolent force was tied to the cursed walls of Grimwood House. He moved toward the staircase that led to the attic, each step a struggle, his legs heavy with dread. The scraping from above grew louder with each step. The voice in his head, the same one that had warned him before, now spoke in a low, terrified whisper. Don't go up there, But he had already made up his mind. He had to know. He had to understand. With a trembling hand, he reached for the attic door and pulled it open. The hinges squealed in protest, and the darkness beyond seemed to stretch on forever, swallowing up the weak beam of his flashlight. The moment he stepped into the narrow staircase leading up, the air turned even colder. The scraping noise was now accompanied by a low, guttural growl, the kind of sound that resonated deep in his chest, making his heart race. Something was up there. Something hungry. He climbed the stairs slowly, painfully aware of every creak of wood beneath his feet, as though the very structure of the house was warning him. But he had already committed himself. The whispers had led him here. He couldn't turn back now. At the top of the stairs, the attic door loomed in front of him, an ominous black void that seemed to suck in the light. He pushed it open with a trembling hand, his breath catching in his throat as the flashlight flickered, barely illuminating the vast emptiness of the room. The attic was exactly as he'd imagined, dusty, cobwebbed, and filled with the remnants of a long-forgotten past. Old furniture lay covered with sheets, their shapes indistinguishable in the dim light. Boxes of forgotten belongings sat untouched, their contents shrouded in darkness. But the moment his eyes fell on one of the far corners of the room, a cold shiver ran through him. There was something there, something watching him. He stepped forward, and as he did, the flashlight beam flickered, revealing a shadow. It was large, far too large for any of the abandoned objects around it, and it was moving. A soft hiss filled the room, followed by a low, rumbling growl that reverberated through the walls. The shadow moved again, its form stretching and undulating like something alive, something unnatural. And then, as the flashlight flickered once more, Elliot saw it. The figure that had been following him. The figure with hollow eyes. But this was different. It was not just a man. Not just a ghost. It was something worse. A low, raspy voice filled the room, a voice that sent an ice-cold shock through his veins. Asterisk, you should have stayed away, Elliot, asterisk. And then the darkness surged forward. Elliot enters the attic, where he finally comes face to face with the true horror of the house. The shadow that moves in the corner reveals a horrifying presence, something far more sinister than the figure he thought he was running from. With the room closing in on him, it's clear that whatever is in the attic has been waiting for him. Can Elliot survive this encounter, or is it too late for him? Asterisk. Elliot's heart stopped as the shadow in the corner of the attic slowly unfurled itself, a massive inky darkness that stretched and moved like it was alive. His flashlight flickered again, casting brief, erratic glimmers of light that barely illuminated the monstrosity before him. The shape that emerged was not human. It was too tall, too wide, its edges constantly shifting as though the darkness itself was not solid but alive, breathing and pulsating. The voice that had whispered his name echoed through his mind, its words clawing at his sanity. Asterisk, you should have stayed away, Elliot, asterisk. He could hear the growl now, a low rumbling noise that seemed to emanate from deep within the earth, as if the house itself were growling at him. The air turned even colder, and the light from his flashlight dimmed, the shadows creeping ever closer, feeding off the light. Sweat beaded on Elliot's brow as he gripped the flashlight tighter, the weight of the metal reassuring in his hands, but utterly useless against the thing before him. The shape seemed to flicker, like a broken image on an old television screen. Then, with a sudden movement, it shifted, or maybe it didn't. It was impossible to tell. All Elliot knew was that it was no longer standing in the corner. It was right there, in front of him, its form impossibly tall and crooked, its eyes empty, black voids that seemed to suck in the light. The air around him thickened, choking off his breath as the figure's hollow gaze locked onto his. The eyes, if they could even be called eyes, were not just empty, they were waiting. Waiting for something. Waiting for him. His pulse hammered in his ears, and for a moment the entire world seemed to blur. The house groaned and shifted, the floorboards creaking beneath his feet. He stumbled back a step, his mind a whirlwind of panic. What are you? He whispered, his voice barely more than a croak. The figure didn't answer with words. Instead, a high-pitched hiss filled the room, a sound like static on a broken radio. The attic walls groaned in response, and Elliot's stomach twisted with nausea. His hand shot out, instinctively reaching for the stairwell behind him, but before he could take another step, the darkness surged forward, blocking his escape. Asterisk, you shouldn't be here, asterisk, the voice whispered again, but this time it was louder, closer, and unmistakably his voice. It was him. The voice in his head. The one who had warned him over and over to leave. And yet here he was trapped. There was no escape. With a sudden jerk, the flashlight flickered out entirely, leaving Elliot in total darkness. The hiss intensified, a shrill sound that scraped against his nerves like nails on a chalkboard. Panic flooded his chest. He fumbled for the flashlight, his hands trembling as he clicked the switch. But nothing. Just the oppressive darkness pressing in on him, wrapping around him, suffocating him. In the pitch black, Elliot felt something move, slow, deliberate. He could hear it now, a soft scrape of a footstep against the wooden floor. It was close, too close. Something reached out from the shadows, wrapping cold fingers around his wrist. Don't, he gasped, trying to pull away. But the grip was unyielding, ice-cold and terrifying. The room spun around him, disorienting, as if the very walls were shifting, bending to trap him. He swung his other arm wildly, but his hand found nothing but air. He was surrounded, completely alone in the darkness, with only the crushing weight of his own fear. And then there it was again, the whisper, the voice curling around him like smoke. Asterisk, you belong to this place now, an asterisk. Elliot's knees buckled beneath him, the weight of the house pressing down on his chest. His breath came in shallow gasps, each one harder to take than the last. He tried to scream, but the sound was swallowed by the darkness. But the darkness was alive. It wasn't just the absence of light, it was aware, watching, listening, pulling at him from all sides. And he knew deep down that it wasn't just the house that was hunting him. Something else was here, something older, something malevolent. The temperature plummeted even further. His breath formed clouds of mist in the air, each exhale a small vapor trail, vanishing into the suffocating cold. Then he felt it, something brushing against his skin, a cold, clammy hand. His body tensed as he turned his head sharply to the side. His heart raced, but there was no escape. The thing, whatever it was right there, inches from his face. He could feel the cold breath on his neck. You cannot escape, Elliot could hear the words now, clear as day, like they were coming from within his own mind. But it wasn't his voice. He could hear the hollow malice in the whisper. His chest tightened, the weight of fear and dread pressing down like a physical force. He reached out, grasping for something, anything. His fingers brushed against a wall, and in that instant, the flashlight flickered back on. The light shot across the room, illuminating the attic once again, and for a moment he thought, it was all a hallucination, a trick of the mind. But as the beam swept across the space, it froze on something so horrifying, so impossible, that he staggered backward in shock. The figure, the thing, was not alone. Surrounding it, almost like an audience, were dozens of other figures, pale, gaunt, and empty-eyed, staring at him with vacant, unblinking stares. They were all the same. The same hollow eyes, the same twisted forms, the same unsettling silence. And they were all moving slowly toward him, their heads jerking unnaturally as if drawn by some invisible string. Elliot's breath caught in his throat. His mind reeled in disbelief. No. Join us. One of the figures whispered in a voice so low and broken that it was barely audible, but Elliot could feel it inside him, like it was seeping into his very bones. You're already one of us, the figure continued, its voice breaking into a soft hiss, a dry rasp that sent chills down his spine. He turned, desperate to escape, to do something, but the staircase was gone. The attic had transformed before his eyes. The walls seemed to close in around him, and the doorway to the stairwell had disappeared, replaced by more shadows, more dark shapes moving toward him, surrounding him. It was as if the house had swallowed him whole. And the figures, they were part of it. They were the house. They were everything. Elliot screamed. He couldn't stop himself, but it was a sound that was quickly drowned by the cacophony of whispers that erupted around him. The shadows swarmed closer, and with one final, terrible whisper, the thing in front of him said, it's time to come home, Elliot, and then everything went black. Elliot is surrounded by the terrifying figures, each more horrific than the last, as they whisper of his fate. The house itself seems to consume him, trapping him in the attic, where he realizes the true horror of Grimwood House. It is not just haunted, it is alive, and it wants him to join its dark, twisted family. The darkness closes in, and he is left with no way out, until everything goes dark, and we are left wondering if Elliot has truly been claimed by the house. Elliot's eyes snapped open, the air thick with the stench of mildew and something far worse, decay. His throat was dry, his body numb, and his mind a haze of confusion. He could hear the distant sound of water dripping, the rhythmic plop, plop echoing through the room. But as his senses slowly returned, he realized something was terribly wrong. He wasn't in the attic anymore. The room he was in now was small, the walls closing in on him like a coffin. His body lay on something cold, wet, and hard, stone maybe, but it felt alive, like it was pulsing beneath him. Panic gripped him as he pushed himself up, but his legs were weak, trembling, barely able to support his weight. He looked around, his breath catching in his chest as he took in his surroundings. The walls of the room were covered in dark, wet stains, slick and glistening like something alive had once slithered across them. The floor was uneven, cracked stone, and the air felt heavy, thick with moisture and the lingering taste of rot. There was no light, only the faintest glow of something else, something not quite visible but ever present, like a shadow that clung to the edges of his vision. The silence was suffocating, oppressive. Elliot stood shakily, pressing his back against the wall, his mind scrambling to make sense of what had happened. Hadn't he been in the attic? Hadn't the darkness closed in on him? And then, nothing. The memories were jagged, fragmented, like pieces of a puzzle that didn't fit together. The last thing he remembered was the overwhelming presence of the shadow, the hollow eyes, and the endless whispers. But now he was here, in this room. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to move toward the far side of the room where a small, narrow door stood ajar. Hesitant, afraid of what might lie beyond, he stepped forward, his feet echoing softly on the wet stone. As he neared the door, a chill washed over him, and he instinctively reached out for the handle, his fingers trembling. Before he could touch it, the door creaked open on its own, the sound sending a shiver of dread down his spine. He froze, his hand hovering just above the handle as the door swung wider, as if something on the other side were inviting him in. Elliot's heart pounded in his chest as he peered into the darkness beyond the door. He couldn't tell what lay in the shadows, but a deep, gnawing feeling told him that whatever it was waiting for him, and it wanted him to enter. Against every instinct in his body, he stepped into the room, his eyes straining to adjust to the lack of light. As he moved deeper into the space, a faint glow grew stronger, seeping through cracks in the walls and floor, casting everything in an eerie, unsettling light. The room was cold, far colder than the one he just left. And then he saw it. At the center of the room, in the midst of the pale glow, sat a large, circular stone table. The table was covered in symbols, strange, jagged markings carved deeply into the surface, almost like scars on the stone. The glow was coming from these symbols, faint but undeniable. Elliot felt drawn to them, as if the very air around the table was humming with an ancient, unholy energy. But before he could move any closer, his eyes were caught by something else, a figure standing at the far end of the room. A woman. She was tall, gaunt, her face hidden in shadow, but there was something undeniably familiar about her. She wore a long, tattered gown that seemed to ripple with movement, as if it were made of shadows themselves. Her hands were clasped together in front of her, as if she were holding something small, something delicate. "Elliot," she whispered, her voice soft but clear, resonating deep inside his skull. "You finally come." He froze. The voice, it wasn't just a voice. It was inside him, echoing in his mind like a memory he had forgotten. The words were his own, twisted and distorted, just like the whispers in the house. His body shook with cold dread as he forced himself to take a step forward. "Who are you?" he managed, his voice hoarse, cracking as though it had not been used in years. The woman stepped forward, her face still hidden in shadow, but the familiar feeling in the pit of his stomach grew stronger. He had heard her voice before, hadn't he? It was so close, so intimate, as if he'd known her his whole life. "I am the one who watches," she said, her voice growing clearer with each word. "The one who waits for you, who calls you home." Elliot's mind raced. Calls me home? Home? What was she talking about? He didn't belong here. He didn't belong in this house. He wasn't part of whatever twisted family it had, whatever cursed history clung to these walls. But the more she spoke, the more her words made sense. He was home. It was as though everything in his life had led him here, to this place, to this moment. The woman's hands slowly opened, revealing the object she had been holding, a small, weathered key. The key gleamed in the pale light, its edges worn smooth with time. Elliot's breath caught in his throat. He knew what it was. He knew. It was the key to the house. The key to Grimwood House. "Take it," she urged, stepping toward him, her voice now laced with urgency. "Take it and you will see. The truth. The family's truth. Your truth." "No," Elliot gasped, shaking his head violently. "No, I don't want it. I don't want anything to do with this place. This isn't my home." But the woman was already there, standing directly in front of him, her shadow enveloping him like a suffocating fog. She reached out, her cold, bony fingers brushing against his hand. And in that instant, something inside him broke. The key felt impossibly heavy in his hand. It pulsed with the same eerie light as the symbols on the table. And as he held it, the room seemed to tremble, the walls vibrating with an energy that was not natural, not human. His chest tightened, and for a moment he thought he might suffocate under the weight of whatever this was. But the woman's eyes, those eyes, now glinted with something far darker. She smiled, her lips stretching too wide, revealing jagged, broken teeth that seemed to mock him. "You belong here, Elliot. You've always belonged here, " The key clicked into place. The room seemed to tilt violently, and the walls of Grimwood House began to close in once more, the shadowy figures filling the corners, whispering louder, urging him to stay. And then, the floor beneath his feet began to shift. Elliot has taken the key, a symbol of his inevitable connection to Grimwood House. The woman who has been guiding him, or perhaps controlling him, reveals the final truth. He has always belonged here. As the house begins to close in around him once more, it's clear that this is only the beginning of something far darker. Will Elliot be able to escape the suffocating pull of the house, or is he already too far gone? Elliot's mind spun with confusion, the room around him spinning as though the very foundation of Grimwood House was warping. The key in his hand pulsed with a rhythm that was both unnatural and hypnotic. The woman's smile, wide and jagged, was the last thing he saw before the ground beneath his feet seemed to dissolve into darkness. He gasped, flailing in midair as the room shifted, twisted, into something other. It was as though the house was no longer a physical place but a living thing, growing, expanding, changing with each heartbeat. The walls seemed to breathe, the floor heaved beneath him, and for a moment, Elliot thought he might lose his grip on reality entirely. His pulse raced, his breath shallow and frantic. He wasn't just trapped in the house anymore, he was becoming the house. The darkness that had once been a mere presence in the corners now filled the entire room, seeping into his skin, into his thoughts. "No," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the thundering pulse in his ears. "This isn't real. This can't be real." But deep down, a sickening, undeniable truth settled in his gut. It was real. Grimwood House was more than just a haunted structure. It was an ancient, malevolent force that had claimed him, body and soul. He tried to shake off the thoughts, but they clung to him, digging into his mind like sharp claws. The woman's voice echoed again, distant but clear. "Asterisk, you're one of us now, Elliot. You've always been one of us, asterisk." The key in his hand began to glow brighter, its light harsh and blinding. Desperation clawed at him. He didn't belong here. He had to get out. He had to. With a sudden jolt, the room snapped back into focus. Elliot stumbled, falling hard against the stone floor. He blinked, his vision clearing, and looked up to find himself standing in what appeared to be a massive, darkened hallway. The stone walls stretched high above him, the ceiling lost in shadow. The air was thick with the stench of mildew, decay, and something else, something metallic like the smell of blood. There were no doors here, no windows, only long, winding corridors that stretched endlessly before him. The hallway seemed to move, the walls warping in on themselves as if they were alive. Shadows shifted, slithering along the floor like serpents, and the faint sound of whispers filled the air. "Where am I?" The question echoed in his mind, but he knew the answer. This was the heart of the house. This was where it all began. The cold, damp air pressed in around him as he stood, rooted to the spot. A distant thudding sound echoed from somewhere deep within the darkness, a slow, rhythmic beat that seemed to vibrate in his bones. It was the sound of something massive, something powerful, something alive. As if drawn by an invisible force, he began to walk. His legs moved of their own accord, the key still clutched tightly in his hand. His feet moved in perfect sync with the pulsing rhythm that echoed through the halls, pulling him forward. No, his mind screamed, but his body ignored him, pushing him deeper into the labyrinthine corridors of Grimwood House. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, wrapping around him like tendrils of smoke. "Asterisk, come closer, Elliot. It's time, asterisk." Each step seemed to take him further away from reality, further into the house that had claimed him. He could feel the weight of it pressing against him, suffocating him with its malevolent presence. And then, without warning, the hall opened up into a vast, cavernous room. The floor was made of smooth, black stone, glistening as if wet, and the air was thick with the smell of old, stagnant water. The room stretched impossibly far, its dimensions lost in the darkness. At the center of the room stood a massive stone altar, covered in more symbols, more markings. The same eerie glow pulsed from the stone, and the air around it hummed with an energy that was both ancient and terrifying. It was as if the altar itself was the heart of the house, the source of its dark power. The key in Elliot's hand throbbed with an intense, rhythmic pulse that seemed to align with the one in the air. His chest tightened as he realized what he had to do. The altar. The key. They were connected, tied together by a force far beyond his understanding. Elliot's legs trembled beneath him as he stepped toward the altar, each movement slow, deliberate. His mind screamed at him to stop, to turn around, but his body refused to listen. He was already too far gone, already tied to the house in ways he couldn't comprehend. The whispers were louder now, a chorus of voices that seemed to come from every direction. The air felt thick with them, suffocating, pressing in on him. They were his thoughts, his memories, his fears. "Asterisk, take your place, Elliot. It's time to come home, asterisk." He reached the altar, his hand trembling as he held the key above it. The moment it touched the surface, a violent tremor rippled through the room. The symbols on the altar flared to life, glowing brighter and brighter until they almost blinded him. The darkness around him thickened, coiling and writhing like a living thing. It surrounded him, cutting off his escape, and with it came the unmistakable presence of the woman, the one who had been leading him all along. "Asterisk, welcome home, asterisk," she whispered again, her voice filled with something more than malice, something ancient. Suddenly the air grew heavier, colder. The house itself seemed to groan in agony, and the floor beneath him began to crack and shift. The stone walls seemed to close in around him, and Elliot realized with growing horror that the house was alive. It was feeding on him, pulling him deeper into its heart, into its very essence. His vision blurred, his thoughts fragmented, and for the first time, Elliot truly understood the nature of the house. It wasn't just a haunted mansion. It was a living entity, a creature with a hunger for souls. It had been waiting for him, watching him, drawing him here. The woman, asterisk, the one who had called him asterisk, moved toward him, her form now fully revealed in the flickering glow. Her face was a grotesque mask of shadows, her eyes hollow and black, but the smile remained. Asterisk, it's time, Elliot, asterisk. Elliot's breath came in short gasps. The darkness pressed in on him from every direction, and the whispers reached a deafening crescendo. He tried to move, tried to escape, but the walls closed in. There was no way out. He was trapped in the heart of the house. And now there was nothing left to do but wait for the final embrace. Elliot finds himself at the heart of Grimwood House, standing before the altar, the key in his hand. The house reveals its true nature, a living, malevolent force, and the woman who has been guiding him leads him to the final, terrible truth. He has always belonged here. The darkness grows ever closer, suffocating him as he realizes there is no escape. Will Elliot survive, or will he be consumed by the house forever? Asterisk. Elliot could feel the weight of the darkness pressing against him, suffocating him. Every breath he took felt like it could be his last. The walls were closing in, inch by inch, as if the house was alive, feeding off his fear, growing stronger with every passing second. His body shook, his mind racing to understand what was happening, but there was no clarity. Only the deafening whispers, the oppressive weight of the air, and the unrelenting pull of the woman's gaze. It's time, Elliot. The words echoed in his mind like a chant, their meaning clear as the woman's form shifted in the dim light. Her shape seemed to bend, to twist with the shadows, but one thing was constant: her eyes. Those hollow black eyes that seemed to pierce into his very soul, and yet, beneath them, a flicker of recognition lingered. She was not just any entity. No, she was something far older, far more dangerous. Something tied to this place, to this cursed house. Why me? Elliot gasped, his voice cracking in the oppressive silence. He tried to take a step back, but his feet felt as though they were glued to the floor. The stone beneath him seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, sending vibrations through his legs, through his chest. The woman tilted her head, her smile widening. You know why, Elliot? You've always known. His heart raced, panic rising in his throat. He had no idea what she meant. There was nothing in his past that could explain this. He was just a man, a journalist, an outsider. There had to be a mistake. I don't. You do? Her voice was soft now, soothing, but it sent a chill crawling up his spine. Everything about you led you here. You and this house, we are tied together. You were never meant to leave. The words hit him like a physical blow. Never meant to leave. The very thought made his skin crawl, his mind flashed to his childhood memories, the darkness that had haunted his nights, the strange dreams of a place he couldn't recognize. But that couldn't be it. That couldn't explain the feeling of familiarity that lingered in this cursed house. A violent tremor shot through the room, the ground beneath him vibrating violently, shaking him from his thoughts. The altar's glow intensified, and the whispers became more insistent, more frantic. Elliot had no choice but to raise his hand, the key still clutched tightly in his palm. The woman stepped forward, her cold, skeletal hand reaching out to grasp his wrist, her touch sending a jolt of ice through his veins. His body locked up, his breath caught in his throat. He wanted to pull away, to escape, but something about her grip was unbreakable. You're not just here for the house, Elliot, she whispered, her voice lowering to a near hiss. You're here because he is waiting for you. The woman's words hung in the air like a poisoned dagger, and for a moment, Elliot felt his chest tighten in a way he couldn't explain. It wasn't just the house. There was something else, something worse. Something that had been watching him. He could feel it now, lurking in the shadows. A cold, malevolent presence. It was there, just beyond his vision, always watching. Suddenly, the air grew heavier, denser, as if the house itself was breathing in time with him. The walls quaked again, and Elliot's thoughts became muddled, disoriented, as the room around him began to warp, shifting like a living nightmare. The stone beneath him cracked, splintering with an almost sentient will. The shadows slithered, moving toward him, closing in. No? Elliot gasped, trying to pull away, but the woman's grip held firm, unyielding. What is happening? What do you mean he's waiting for me? The woman's lips curled into a dark smile, revealing sharp, jagged teeth. Her voice dropped to a whisper, laced with something ancient and terrifying. That is not something you need to understand just yet, she said. But you will. When the time comes. The tremors in the room intensified, the very air growing thick with a cold, oppressive weight. And then, from the depths of the shadows, something emerged. At first, it was only a whisper, a movement at the edge of his vision. But then it grew, expanding into something far darker. Something that could not be ignored. A figure. It was tall, impossibly tall, its body cloaked in shadow, its features hidden beneath a dark, hooded cloak that billowed like smoke. The figure moved slowly, its presence commanding the room, its very existence bending the air around it. Elliot froze, his heart racing, the blood draining from his face. His eyes locked on the figure as it moved toward him, its form seeming to stretch and shift like a nightmare come to life. The air grew colder, the darkness deeper. The whispers crescendoed into a deafening roar. And then it spoke. Elliot Grayson, The voice was deep, guttural, and laced with 1,000 years of sorrow and malice. It was the voice of something ancient, something that had lived and died countless times. It was the voice of the Watcher of the Hollow. Elliot's knees buckled beneath him, and he fell to the floor, his hands scrambling for purchase. His mind was a blur of confusion, panic, and fear. But one thing remained clear: he was not alone. The Watcher stood above him, its shadow stretching across the room, the very air seeming to bend in its presence. Its voice rumbled through the very stone of the house, reverberating in Elliot's skull. "You are the last," it whispered, its breath cold and suffocating. "The last of your bloodline, the last of the cursed. Your family's sins have not been forgiven. And now it is time to pay." The figure moved closer, the ground beneath it cracking, the stone splitting open as though it were alive. Elliot's heart raced in his chest, his mind screaming for him to run, but his body refused to move. The house was holding him in place, anchoring him to this moment, this fate. The last of his bloodline, the words echoed in his mind, the weight of their meaning crashing over him like a tidal wave. He tried to remember his family, his ancestors, but the memories were blurred, twisted by years of abandonment and self-doubt. Hadn't he always known there was something wrong with his family? Something dark? The Watcher loomed above him, its face still hidden in the shadows. But as it stepped closer, a faint glow began to form in the depths of its hood, revealing only empty sockets where eyes should have been. "You have come to claim what was lost," the Watcher's voice rumbled, "but you cannot run from what you are, what you have become. The house calls for you. Your soul is bound here, Elliot." The words hit him like a hammer. His mind was reeling, his body trembling with the force of the realization. There was no escape, not from the house, not from his bloodline, and certainly not from the Watcher. Suddenly the air grew unbearably thick. The ground beneath Elliot's feet cracked open, and the coldness intensified, settling deep into his bones. A low, guttural roar filled the room, shaking the very foundation of Grimwood House. The key in Elliot's hand pulsed violently, its glow blinding as if it were alive. And then the floor split wide open. Elliot faces the full force of Grimwood House's malevolent power as the Watcher of the Hollow reveals itself. The ancient entity, tied to Elliot's bloodline and the house's dark past, looms over him, its intentions clear. The floor cracks open beneath him, and he is pulled deeper into the house's dark embrace. With nowhere left to run, Elliot must confront his darkest fears, his family's twisted legacy, and the force that has been watching him from the shadows. The air in Grimwood House was suffocating, heavy with a coldness that gnawed at Elliot's bones. The floor split beneath him with a loud, sickening crack, and for a split second he thought he might fall into the abyss. His heart pounded against his chest, desperate to flee, but his legs refused to move. The Watcher stood above him, its form stretching, shifting, as though it was not fully bound to the physical realm. Its hollow, empty sockets seemed to pierce through him, past flesh and bone, into the very core of his being. "You cannot escape," the Watcher intoned, its voice an ancient whisper that slithered through the walls like smoke. "You are tied to this place, Elliot. Your soul belongs to Grimwood." The ground beneath him trembled again, and Elliot felt a sharp, jarring pain shoot through his legs as if the very earth was trying to pull him into its depths. He tried to scream, but the words were caught in his throat, strangled by fear. His fingers tightened around the key, the pulsing object now feeling like a living thing, like an anchor tying him to this nightmare. "Who are you?" Elliot gasped, barely able to force the words out. "What do you want from me?" The Watcher remained silent for a moment, the darkness around it thickening as if it were considering the question. Then a chilling laugh, low and rasping, filled the room. It was a sound that rattled the very air, vibrating in Elliot's chest like the hum of 1,000 forgotten voices. "Who am I?" the Watcher repeated, its voice taking on a mocking tone. "I am what remains of those who have come before you. I am the forgotten, the forsaken. I am the price your bloodline has been paying for generations. Elliot's mind reeled, the weight of the words sinking in. He wanted to understand, to make sense of this twisted reality, but there was no clarity. Only darkness. The woman's chilling smile flashed in his mind again, and he could hear her whispering, her words a ghostly echo in his ears. Your family has been bound to this house for centuries, Elliot. It is not just a place. It is a prison. A trap. A hunger that consumes all who come here. His breath caught in his throat. My family? The question felt absurd, but deep inside he knew it was true. The house had always seemed to pull at him, whispering from the edges of his memory, a forgotten legacy that he couldn't escape. The bloodline, the watcher continued, its voice cold and steady, has always returned. Each generation serves its purpose. Each generation falls prey to the house's insatiable hunger. And now it is your turn. Elliot's eyes snapped wide with horror as the realization hit him. His family had been cursed. He wasn't just a victim of circumstance. He had always been chosen, like the generations before him, to feed the insidious power of Grimwood House. No, he whispered, shaking his head, his hands trembling. I didn't. My family didn't. The watcher tilted its head, the darkness swirling around its form like a living thing. You have always known, Elliot. The house has called you here from the very beginning. You've seen its signs, its symbols in your dreams. You were drawn here by the blood in your veins. Elliot's vision blurred, and for a moment he was somewhere else. A place that felt like home, but wrong. He was a child again, standing in the shadow of a tall, foreboding house. The windows were dark, but the door stood open, beckoning him. In his hand he clutched a key, this key, and the same cold, suffocating presence pressed in on him. The watcher, the figure, hidden in shadow, loomed just behind him in the dream. It whispered to him even then, its words lost in the wind, its gaze burning into the back of his skull. The house had always been there, waiting for him to return. A cold laugh escaped him, bitter and hollow. You're telling me that I'm part of this curse? That my family, my bloodline, it's been leading me here all along? The watcher's presence loomed larger, more tangible now, as if the house itself had become the creature standing before him. The shadows shifted, revealing hints of gnarled, twisted roots spreading through the floor beneath them, roots that seemed to pulse with life. Yes, Elliot, the watcher crooned. You are the final piece. Your blood binds you to this place. It has always been this way. The woman's voice echoed again in his mind. Asterisk, you've always been one of us, star dot. The ground shifted beneath him once more, and the key in his hand pulsed violently, as though it was calling to something deep within the house. The shadows twisted, coiling around his legs, pulling at him with a force he couldn't resist. No, he shouted, finally finding his voice. This can't be real. It can't be. But the house answered with a loud, agonizing screech, the stone walls groaning under the pressure of some unimaginable force. The watcher stepped closer, its form flickering and shifting, moving impossibly fast. The darkness around it deepened, almost suffocating him. You still don't understand, do you, Elliot? The watcher's voice had become a growl, a thing of pure malice. The house feeds on your blood. It has for centuries. It will continue to do so forever. You cannot escape. You cannot run from what you are. A violent force surged through him, tearing at his insides, and Elliot cried out, dropping to his knees as the weight of the truth settled over him like a crushing weight. I am the last, the thought cut through him like a blade, the final thread of his hopes snapping under the pressure. His family's sins, their past, it had all been building to this moment of reckoning. The key in his hand burned with an intense heat, its pulse now rapid, frantic. The walls around him began to distort, the stone stretching, bending, as the house itself seemed to react to the power of the key. You will stay here, Elliot. Forever, the watcher whispered, its voice curling around his mind like a vice. You will serve the house just as all the others did. Your blood has already been paid, but the house demands more. It demands your soul. Elliot's breath came in shallow gasps, his heart thundering in his chest. He could feel the presence of the house in every corner, in every crack in the walls, every whisper in the air. He was trapped, his soul bound to the house, a part of its insatiable hunger. But as the darkness pressed in on him, something inside Elliot, something deep, hidden beneath the layers of fear and confusion, shifted. There was no escape, not from the house, not from his bloodline. But there was something else. A part of him, buried deep within, refused to give in. Not yet. With trembling hands, he lifted the key, feeling its power surge through him like electricity. The shadows writhed around him, But for the first time, Elliot felt a spark of resistance. It wasn't enough. Not yet. But it could be. Elliot is confronted by the Watcher, who reveals the full extent of his family's curse and his connection to the malevolent force that haunts Grimwood House. The Watcher explains that Elliot's bloodline has always served the house's insatiable hunger, and that there is no escape. As the darkness closes in, Elliot struggles to grasp the gravity of his situation. But beneath his fear, a flicker of resistance remains. Could the key be his only chance? Asterisk. Elliot's head was spinning. The weight of the revelation, the unthinkable truth, hung over him like a storm cloud ready to burst. His family, his bloodline, had been bound to Grimwood House for centuries, feeding it, serving it, becoming part of its insidious hunger. And now he was the last one left. The final sacrifice. But even as the darkness closed in on him, even as the cold fingers of the Watcher curled around his soul, a primal instinct surged through him. He could feel the pulse of the key in his hand, thrumming like a heartbeat, vibrating with a power he couldn't yet comprehend. The house may have claimed his ancestors, but he refused to let it claim him. Not yet. The Watcher stepped closer, its shadow stretching over Elliot, its form flickering in the dim light like smoke, elusive and menacing. Its voice was a low, guttural rasp, the sound of 1,000 years of torment echoing through the stone walls. You cannot fight fate, Elliot. Your blood is mine. Your soul will belong to Grimwood, just like all those before you. Elliot's breath was shallow, his mind racing, grasping for anything, any shred of hope that could break this cycle. But with every passing second, the weight of the house grew heavier, the oppressive atmosphere thickening around him. The walls seemed to breathe, pulsing with an almost malevolent life. His fingers tightened around the key, the cool metal burning into his palm, sending a jolt of energy up his arm. It wasn't just a key, it was something more. Something alive. And in that moment, Elliot knew that the key was not just a means of escape. It was his last weapon, his last chance. The Watcher was now directly in front of him, its presence overwhelming, suffocating. You cannot fight what you are, Elliot. The house has claimed you. There is no escape. But Elliot, feeling a surge of defiance unlike anything he had ever experienced, lifted the key higher, his grip tightening until his knuckles were white. The shadows around him writhed, recoiling from the key as if it were a beacon of light in an endless void. No, Elliot whispered, his voice hoarse but resolute. I will not let you have me. The Watcher laughed, a deep, unsettling sound that reverberated through the walls. Foolish child, it hissed. You are already mine. Your soul is already bound. But as the creature spoke, Elliot felt something within the key, a vibration, a resonance, an understanding. It was as if the key itself was calling to him, urging him to unlock something deep within the house, something ancient and hidden. Elliot didn't know what it was, but he knew that the key could not just open doors, it could open the house itself. Without thinking, his hand shot out, and with a swift, desperate motion, he slammed the key into the cold, stone wall beside him. The moment it touched the surface, the room trembled. The very air seemed to shift, as if the house was holding its breath. Then, with an ear-splitting screech, the wall cracked open, revealing a passage, narrow and winding, descending into the darkness. The Watcher froze, its form flickering in and out of existence. What have you done? The voice was a hiss, a snarl of rage that cut through the silence like a blade. Elliot didn't hesitate. He knew that the Watcher was trying to intimidate him, to make him doubt his decision, but he couldn't afford to listen to the thing anymore. The key had unlocked something buried deep within the house, and he had no choice but to find out what it was. Only one way to find out, he muttered, his voice steadier than he felt. He took a step toward the newly revealed passage, his legs trembling beneath him, but his resolve hardening. The Watcher's rage was palpable, the very air vibrating with its fury. Don't do it, Elliot, the Watcher warned, its voice dark and foreboding. The house will consume you. But Elliot had already made his choice. He stepped into the narrow passage, the walls pressing in around him as he descended into the depths of Grimwood House. The key burned in his hand, its glow lighting the path ahead, casting eerie shadows along the walls. The passage seemed endless, winding deeper and deeper into the earth, until Elliot could no longer hear the Watcher's voice, until the only sound was the echo of his own breath and the faint hum of the key. The walls were slick with moisture, the air thick and damp, and with every step, Elliot felt as if the house itself was closing in around him. The darkness seemed to stretch on forever, and the further he went, the more he felt the oppressive presence of something other, something ancient. Suddenly, the passage opened up into a vast chamber, a cavernous room that stretched beyond the reach of the key's light. The air was thick with dust and decay, the walls covered in strange symbols and markings that Elliot couldn't comprehend. The chamber was cold, impossibly so, and as he stepped inside, the floor beneath him groaned in protest, as if the house itself was alive, shifting in response to his presence. At the center of the room was a large, ornate altar, its surface covered in a thick layer of dust and grime. But there was something else, a shape, something that seemed to move within the shadows of the room just beyond the reach of the key's light. Elliot froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel it, the weight of the house pressing down on him, suffocating him. The altar was the heart of the house, and whatever had been bound to it was waiting for him. He didn't have time to think. The key pulsed again, stronger now, as if urging him forward. Slowly, cautiously, he approached the altar, the shadows seeming to shift and swirl around him. Then, with a sudden movement, the shadows parted, and Elliot's eyes locked onto the figure standing at the altar. It was her. The woman, the one who had haunted his dreams, the one who had whispered to him in the dark. But she wasn't just a ghost anymore. She was something else. Her eyes were wide, vacant, her face pale and twisted, but her presence was overwhelming. The very air around her seemed to shimmer with a dark energy. Her lips curled into a twisted smile as she spoke. "You've come at last," she whispered, her voice barely audible, but it reverberated in Elliot's skull like a song of despair. "You cannot escape what you are, what you've always been. The house will have you, just like it has taken all the others." Elliot's pulse raced as the realization hit him. The woman wasn't just a spirit, she was part of the house. She was bound to it as he was. And just like her, he would never be free. But as the darkness pressed in around him, the key in his hand pulsed again, brighter now. It wasn't just a key, it was the answer. And the truth was about to unfold. Elliot faces the woman from his past, whose ghostly form now seems tied to the very heart of Grimwood House. As the key pulses in his hand, Elliot realizes that he and the woman are bound by the same curse. But there is something else at play in the shadows, and the truth of what he must face to break the cycle is finally within reach. Will he uncover the secrets of Grimwood, or will the house claim him like the generations before him? Asterisk. Elliot stood frozen before the altar, his heart thundering in his chest as the woman's twisted, vacant smile stretched wider. The shadows around them seemed to thicken, curling and writhing like sentient things, hungry and alive. The air in the chamber felt suffocating, heavy with 1,000 years of despair and decay. And in the center of it all, the key in Elliot's hand thrummed, its light flickering in time with his pulse. "You've come," she whispered again, the words echoing in his ears like a haunting lullaby. "At last you've come to join us." Elliot's breath hitched, his hand trembling around the key. He wanted to scream, to demand answers, but the woman's presence seemed to suck the very air from his lungs. Her eyes were empty, no pupils, no warmth, only the hollow void of something lost and forgotten. "Who are you?" Elliot finally managed to rasp, his voice barely above a whisper. The woman tilted her head slightly, a mocking gleam flickering in her empty eyes. "Who am I?" she echoed, her voice dripping with contempt. "I am what remains of all those who were sacrificed. I am the last of the bloodline, the one who couldn't escape, the one who failed." Elliot felt a chill race down his spine. "The bloodline?" he repeated, the words tasting bitter on his tongue. "You mean me?" She nodded slowly, her movements unnatural, jerky, as if the very act of her existence was something against nature. "You are my descendant," she said softly, the words coming out like a sigh, a whisper of something forgotten. "But you are also the last one, the last of your blood to carry the curse." Elliot's head spun. A descendant? The woman who haunted his dreams, who whispered to him in his moments of weakness, was somehow connected to his own blood. The key pulsed again, its rhythm now rapid, almost frantic. It wasn't just a tool, it was a bridge, a key to something far darker, far older than he could imagine. "You," Elliot began, but his voice faltered. He couldn't form the words. His mind raced, trying to grasp the truth, but it kept slipping through his fingers like sand. She stepped closer, her movements unsettling, like a marionette pulled by unseen strings. "It is all inevitable," she said, her voice a cold, monotonous whisper. "Grimwood House is not just a house, Elliot. It is alive. It feeds. And we, the bloodline, have always been its source. Our souls, our flesh, they are what keep it whole." Elliot staggered backward, his legs weak beneath him, but the key seemed to pull him forward, toward her. Toward the altar. "Your ancestors made a deal," the woman continued, her voice growing colder, more hollow with each passing word. They gave their souls to the house, to the Watcher, in exchange for power, for safety. They thought they could escape the consequences, but the house does not forgive. The house does not let go. A flash of understanding pierced Elliot's mind. The house, the Watcher, the key, it was all part of the same curse, a cycle that had trapped his family for generations, and now it was his turn to pay the price. No, Elliot whispered, shaking his head in disbelief. This isn't happening. This can't be true. I didn't choose this. The woman's laugh was low and guttural, like the rattle of chains. You never chose it. The house chooses for you. It has always chosen, and it will always choose. You are just another link in the chain, Elliot. Another sacrifice. The key in his hand pulsed again, its light now blinding, filling the chamber with an almost unbearable intensity. The walls seemed to tremble, as if the house itself was responding to the power of the key. The altar groaned beneath the weight of the history, the blood, the souls that had been sacrificed to feed the house's insatiable hunger. Elliot's mind reeled. There was no way out. Not for him. Not for anyone. His family had been doomed the moment they stepped foot in Grimwood House. The house wasn't just a place. It was a living entity, a force that fed on blood, on souls, on fear. You're wrong, he said, his voice trembling but defiant. I won't be part of this. I won't be another sacrifice. I will end it. The woman's eyes darkened, the hollowness within them deepening. You cannot end it, Elliot. You cannot break the cycle. The house demands its price. You can never be free. Suddenly, the shadows around them shifted, and a low, guttural growl rumbled through the chamber. The walls seemed to pulse with a malevolent life of their own, the very air thick with the presence of something ancient and terrible. The Watcher's voice, now 1,000 whispers, filled Elliot's ears. You cannot fight what is coming, Elliot, the Watcher hissed. The house has claimed you. Your blood is mine. Your soul will serve Grimwood forever. Elliot gritted his teeth, fighting the overwhelming fear that threatened to consume him. The key was still in his hand, its power surging through him, and for the first time he understood its true purpose. The key wasn't just a tool to open doors. It was a weapon that could break the curse. But to use it, to truly end the cycle, he would have to sacrifice everything. He looked at the altar, the woman standing before it, her ghostly form flickering with unnatural energy. The blood of his ancestors, the blood of his family, was bound to the house. It was the price they had paid, and now he stood at the threshold of that same fate. But there was one thing they hadn't considered. One thing the house couldn't control. Elliot clenched his fists around the key, his fingers digging into the cold metal, feeling the pulse of power surge through him. He couldn't be the last. He couldn't let Grimwood win. With a single, decisive motion, he raised the key above his head. Enough, he shouted, his voice trembling with fury and fear. I refuse to be a part of this. The key's light flared brighter, blinding, and the walls around him seemed to shudder, as if the house itself was recoiling from its power. The woman screamed, her form flickering and distorting as if she were being torn apart. No, she wailed. You don't understand. You can't. But her voice was swallowed by the light, and as Elliot pressed the key forward, he felt the ground beneath him tremble, a shockwave of energy rippling through the very foundation of Grimwood House. The darkness roared, the house itself seeming to scream in rage. The altar began to crack, the symbols on the walls twisting, as if the very fabric of the house was unraveling. Elliot held his breath, praying that he was doing the right thing. The key's power surged, and in that moment he realized he wasn't just fighting for his life. He was fighting for the lives of all those who had come before him. For every soul that had been taken, for every life consumed by the house's insatiable hunger. And as the key burned with an almost blinding light, he knew the battle was far from over. Elliot faces the woman who reveals the cursed legacy of his family, but as he grips the key with newfound resolve, he makes a desperate, final stand against the house. The light of the key seems to tear at the very fabric of Grimwood House itself, but will it be enough to break the curse, or will it only serve to unleash something far darker? Asterisk. The light from the key blazed brighter than anything Elliot had ever seen. It was as if the very soul of Grimwood House was being torn apart, unraveling like a fragile thread, pulled in every direction. The walls of the chamber cracked, the ceiling groaned, and the ancient stones beneath his feet trembled as though the house itself were fighting back. The woman, the last remnant of his bloodline, screamed in agony, her body twisting and flickering like a shadow in the wind, pulled between this world and something darker, something far worse. Elliot didn't look away. He couldn't afford to. He had to see it through. The key's pulse grew louder, beating in time with his own heart, each thrum sending a jolt of raw energy through him. His hand burned, the heat of the key searing into his flesh, but he gripped it tighter, willing himself to hold on. It was the only thing keeping him tethered to reality, the only thing that might break the cycle. The woman's ghostly form flickered once more, then dissolved into a swirl of smoke and ash, leaving behind only the faintest trace of her voice. "You think you've won," she whispered, but her words were drowned by the deafening roar of the house. "You think you can escape, but the house always takes." And then, just as quickly, she was gone. The chamber fell silent. The vibrations of the house slowly stopped. The key pulsed one last time, a final surge of energy, and then the light faded, leaving only darkness. Elliot stood there, alone. The room was still. Too still. The air was thick, suffocating, but the oppressive weight that had clung to him throughout his time in Grimwood House seemed to lift, just slightly. As though some dark, ancient force had been appeased. Or destroyed. He didn't know which. He looked around the chamber, his breath heavy, his legs shaky. The altar that had been the heart of the house, the thing that had kept it alive for centuries, was cracked, broken, the strange symbols etched into the stone now faded and warped, as if their power had been drained. The walls, once pulsating with dark energy, now stood still, empty. Grimwood House itself felt quieter. For a moment, Elliot allowed himself to believe it was over. But then, deep within the silence, he heard it. A low, guttural whisper. Faint at first, barely audible but unmistakable. "Fool." It was the Watcher's voice, its presence looming over him once again. Elliot's stomach churned. He could feel it, that cold, creeping dread returning with a vengeance. The house wasn't done with him. Not yet. "You think you've won?" The Watcher's voice grew louder, more insistent. "You think the house is gone? You are a part of this place, Elliot. Just as your ancestors were. And you will never escape." The air around him seemed to thicken, the shadows stretching and reaching out toward him like claws. But this time, Elliot didn't flinch. The key was still in his hand, its power now dim but still there, pulsing weakly, a reminder that he wasn't entirely powerless. He took a step forward, then another, his eyes scanning the darkened room. The house wanted him, wanted his soul, just as it had wanted all those before him. But Elliot was done running. Done being its pawn. He wasn't just a Grayson. He wasn't just a victim of this place. He was free. He thrust the key forward, toward the altar, toward the heart of Grimwood House, and for the first time the house seemed to hesitate. The shadows around him recoiled, as if they were afraid of the key's light. "You're nothing," Elliot muttered, his voice shaking but resolute. "And I am nothing like them." The ground beneath him trembled again, but this time it was different. This wasn't the deep rumble of something ancient coming to life. It was the fading of something, the slow dissolution of power, like the last breath of a dying beast. He could hear it now, the sound of the house beginning to collapse, the creaking of wood, the rending of stone, as if Grimwood were falling apart piece by piece. He wasn't sure how much time he had, but for the first time since he'd entered the cursed manor, Elliot felt a glimmer of hope. The house was dying. The Watcher's voice came again, weaker now, more distant. "You cannot escape it. You cannot escape me." But Elliot didn't listen. The shadows were retreating. The air was growing clearer, less oppressive. He knew now what he had to do. He ran. Every instinct in his body screamed for him to get out, to leave this cursed place before it was too late. The house groaned, the walls shaking violently, but Elliot kept running, following the faintest sliver of light that now shone through the cracks. The house was crumbling, and he had to get out before it took him with it. His footsteps echoed through the decaying halls, louder now, but not the ghostly footsteps of the Watcher. These were his own, real, tangible. With every step, the oppressive weight that had clung to him for so long seemed to lift. Then he reached it, the front door. It was standing ajar, the wind howling through the crack, the first breath of fresh air he'd felt since entering Grimwood House. He hesitated only for a moment, just long enough to glance over his shoulder and see the darkness closing in, the house shifting, groaning in agony. But the door was open, the night beyond waiting. With one final, defiant breath, Elliot stepped through the threshold. The door slammed shut behind him. For a moment, the night outside was still. The fog had dissipated, leaving only the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. The air was cold, crisp, clean. And Grimwood House was gone. There was no sign of it, no trace left of the place that had haunted him for so long. It was as though the house had never been there at all, swallowed whole by the very ground beneath it. Elliot stood there for a long time, just staring at the spot where the house had once stood. His mind was a swirl of disbelief, of relief, of exhaustion. He was free. It was over. But then, just as he was about to turn and leave, he heard a faint sound, so quiet it could have been the wind. A whisper just on the edge of his hearing. "Elliot." He froze, his blood running cold. He knew that voice. He didn't need to turn around. Grimwood House wasn't gone. It was still watching. Elliot escapes Grimwood House only to realize that the house, its influence, its malevolent presence, has never truly left. The house may have crumbled, but its evil has a way of lingering, and the watcher is still out there, waiting for its next victim. The horror is far from over. The storm hit as soon as the last rays of daylight were swallowed by the horizon. The wind howled through the trees, rattling the windows of the house. The clouds piled high, black and swollen, blocking out the stars. The rain lashed against the walls with a fury that seemed almost deliberate, as though the night itself were trying to drown everything in its path. And then the knock. Elliot Grayson stood frozen in the hallway just a few steps from the front door. His heart had skipped a beat, but he quickly dismissed the feeling. It was probably a tree branch or a stray animal, maybe a neighbor who had lost their way in the storm. The house he had rented was isolated, perched on the edge of a small town that didn't even register on most maps. A place to escape, a place to disappear. But that knock, it was deliberate. There was a heaviness to it that sent a ripple of unease through his chest. "Hello?" he called out, stepping cautiously toward the door. His voice, weak and uncertain, was swallowed by the thunder outside. The knock came again, louder this time, the sound like something scratching at his very soul. Elliot hesitated. What the hell was he doing here? The house was cheap and the owner had promised seclusion, but even the air in this place felt wrong. A flicker of motion caught his eye, something outside the small window beside the door. A shadow. He could barely make out the figure in the dark, but it was there. A tall, thin man stood just beyond the porch, facing the door, unmoving. His coat was drenched, but it didn't seem to bother him. The man had the look of someone who had been out in the rain for hours, yet he appeared strangely composed, his face shrouded in the darkness of the storm. Elliot's instincts screamed at him to lock the door, to turn and run, but something kept him there, rooted to the spot. The knock had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that pressed in on him from all sides. He opened the door just a crack. "Can I help you?" His voice was barely above a whisper. The stranger's eyes gleamed in the dim light, a pale, sickly shade of yellow, as if the storm itself had drained all the color from his face. "I'm sorry to disturb you," the man said, his voice soft, almost comforting. "But I was hoping I could ask you something. A simple favor. I've been looking for a place to stay." Before Elliot could answer, the stranger's gaze flicked over his shoulder, toward the dark interior of the house. He seemed to linger there for a moment too long, and something twisted in Elliot's gut. He wasn't sure what it was, but it made him instinctively take a step back. "I'm not sure," Elliot began, but the man cut him off. "You won't want to be out there in the storm," he said, voice lowering to almost a whisper. "Not tonight. It's not safe." There it was again. The feeling, cold and sharp, creeping into his bones. "I really don't know if I can help you," Elliot said, his hand trembling slightly on the doorframe. "I'm just passing through." The stranger's smile, thin and cruel, curled at the corners of his lips. "Of course I understand, but you'll see. You'll see soon enough." Elliot didn't want to hear any more. He shut the door, the sound of the rain filling his ears as he bolted the lock. He turned and pressed his back against the door, his breath heavy, his heart racing. It had been a long time since he had felt the weight of such dread, but something about that stranger, the way his eyes lingered, the way his words seemed to claw at him, made Elliot feel exposed, as if he were being watched. The man stood there, unmoving on the porch. A few seconds passed, then a few minutes. Elliot didn't dare look again. He glanced at the clock. Nearly midnight. The clock's ticking was the only sound in the house. Elliot moved through the dimly lit rooms, trying to focus on something, anything. His eyes kept flicking to the front window, half expecting to see the stranger still standing there. But there was nothing. No movement. Just the rain and the wind. The house, old and creaking, seemed to be whispering to him from the walls, its floors groaning beneath his feet with every step. He needed a drink. The kitchen was cold, empty. The cabinets stood open, their contents a mismatched collection of broken mugs and chipped plates. Elliot's eyes caught on a cracked photograph on the counter, one that hadn't been there earlier. He reached for it. The picture was yellowed, faded with age, showing a group of people standing together in front of an old house. This house, but long before it had fallen into disrepair. There were 4 people in the photo, smiling, their faces youthful and full of life. A family, perhaps. but the faces seemed off. Their smiles didn't quite reach their eyes, and there was something about the way they stood, so perfectly still, that unsettled him. He set the photo back down, his hand trembling. He needed to get out of here. The storm was picking up again, the wind howling outside, the rain slamming against the windows with renewed intensity. Elliot glanced at the door again, his mind racing. There had been something about the stranger. Something wrong. A feeling in his gut that told him the man wasn't just lost. He was here for something else. The lights flickered. Elliot jumped, heart pounding in his chest. The house felt colder now. He could almost feel the weight of the air pressing down on him, as though the very walls were closing in. He tried to shake off the panic rising in his throat, telling himself it was just the storm, just his nerves. But deep down he knew something was wrong. A sound echoed from the hallway. The unmistakable sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, but no one was there. Elliot's stomach churned. He wasn't alone. The footsteps continued, growing louder, closer. He backed away, his breath shallow and quick. The house seemed to grow darker, more oppressive. He turned and bolted for the front door, but as his hand touched the handle, he froze. There was something on the other side. A shadow. It pressed against the door, heavy and suffocating. It was as if the house itself was holding him inside. A voice whispered from the dark. "You can't leave. Not tonight." Elliot spun around, but there was no one there. Just the darkness. His heart was a drum in his chest as he slowly turned the handle and flung the door open. The porch was empty, but the air was different now. Thicker. Humming with an unnatural energy. And there, in the distance just beyond the trees, was the figure. The stranger. Standing motionless as if waiting for him. And then, as if sensing his gaze, the stranger turned. A slow, deliberate movement. And smiled. Elliot slammed the door shut, the force of it reverberating through the house like a gunshot. He leaned against the cool wood, his breath ragged in his chest. He could still see the stranger, the way he had turned slowly, with a deliberate slowness that made Elliot's skin crawl. He didn't want to look again, but his eyes betrayed him. He had to know. Just a glance. The porch was still empty. The stranger was gone. Elliot let out a breath, unsure if it was relief or something darker settling into his gut. He stepped back from the door, his hands shaking as he slid the bolt shut. The house was silent now, save for the storm that continued to rage outside, battering the windows with relentless fury. The walls felt as if they were closing in. Elliot moved through the house, every creak of the floorboards under his feet making his muscles tighten. He tried to focus, tried to convince himself it was nothing. Just an old house, old wood, the way the wind and rain could trick the mind into hearing things. But deep down he knew. The air was wrong. There was something here. Something waiting. He pulled open the living room door and stepped into the darkness, his hands still trembling. The only light came from a flickering lamp on the far wall, casting long, spindly shadows that seemed to stretch and twist in unnatural ways. The house felt alive. Elliot turned quickly, as though expecting to see the figure standing there again, watching him from the shadows. But the room was empty. The air felt thick, though, as if the space itself was breathing. He shook his head. He had to keep it together. He couldn't let the fear consume him. This was just paranoia, nothing more. He reached for the lamp, but as his fingers brushed the switch, the lights went out completely. Click. The silence was profound. The world outside the house had faded into a distant memory, and inside, Elliot felt as though he were trapped in some otherworldly void. The rain was a constant roar against the windows, but it barely seemed to exist anymore. He needed to breathe. Elliot made his way toward the hallway, groping in the dark. The door to the kitchen was just ahead, and as he moved closer, the faintest sound, almost imperceptible, caught his attention. A whisper. At first, he thought it was the wind, the storm carrying strange voices. But the whisper came again, clearer this time, more distinct. "Leave?" He froze. It came from the kitchen. His heart raced as his hand instinctively reached out for the doorframe, steadying himself. A part of him wanted to turn and run, to escape the house altogether. But he couldn't. Not yet. Not when he was so close to understanding what was happening here. With slow, deliberate steps, he crossed the threshold into the kitchen. It was even darker than the hallway. The air smelled damp, heavy with the lingering scent of mildew. The shadows seemed to move on their own, undulating with a life of their own. The whisper came again, clearer this time. "You shouldn't be here." Elliot's pulse quickened, his hand shaking as he gripped the edge of the counter. The voice sounded distant but somehow familiar, as though it had been waiting for him. Waiting for him to make a choice. A choice he couldn't quite understand. The fridge, old and rusted, hummed in the corner, a a soft drone that made the silence even more oppressive. Elliot's eyes fell on the photograph he had seen earlier, the one of the family standing in front of the house. It was on the kitchen counter now, but it had shifted. The faces, those strange frozen faces, were no longer smiling. Their eyes, hollow and dark, stared back at him, as if accusing him of something he couldn't understand. Something deep inside him told him to leave, to get out. The storm was nothing compared to the suffocating feeling that had settled into the pit of his stomach. He was losing time. Suddenly, a cold draft cut through the room, causing the hairs on his neck to rise. The window, the one behind the sink, creaked open on its own. He didn't want to look, but he did anyway. The figure was standing outside again. Not on the porch this time. He was standing at the edge of the yard, beyond the trees, his back to the house, his head tilted slightly, as if listening to something only he could hear. The man's coat flapped in the wind, his body swaying ever so slightly. The darkness seemed to shift around him as if he were part of it. The way he stood, so still, so unblinking, was as unnatural as the feeling gnawing at Elliot's chest. It wasn't just the storm. Elliot's feet moved before he could even think about it. He had to know. Had to understand. The figure didn't turn as he approached, didn't acknowledge him in any way. Elliot stopped just at the edge of the yard, his breath visible in the cold air. He stared at the back of the man's coat, the unsettling silence between them stretching like a chasm. "Who are you?" Elliot called out, his voice trembling with a mix of fear and curiosity. The stranger didn't respond. Then, in the thickest, most unnatural silence, the wind suddenly stopped. The man turned, slowly, methodically. His eyes gleamed in the pale light, a sickly yellow that flickered like a candle's flame in a gust of wind. He smiled, but it wasn't a smile of comfort. It wasn't a smile at all. It was something far darker. "I told you," the man said softly, his voice carrying across the still air like an omen. "You won't be leaving. Not tonight." And then, as if the world had been holding its breath, the ground beneath Elliot's feet trembled. The very earth seemed to shift. A whisper, a soft hissing sound began to rise from the trees. And then he heard it clearly. His name. Elliot. The voice was unmistakable, deep and familiar. His heart clenched as he spun around. The trees had begun to move, the shadows swirling around him like a living thing. The wind had returned, but it was no longer the storm. It was something else, something malevolent. Something that was calling his name. Elliot stumbled backward, his mind racing. The man, the stranger, was still standing in the yard, his face now twisted in something that could only be described as glee. Elliot's chest heaved, his breath coming in sharp gasps as he turned and fled back toward the house, his feet barely touching the ground. As he reached the door, the ground beneath him shook again, more violently this time, as though something immense were stirring deep within the earth. The trees creaked and groaned in the wind, bending under the pressure, as though something ancient and terrible were waking. He slammed the door behind him and bolted it again, his eyes wild with panic. The house was quieter now, but the air still hummed with an energy that made his skin crawl. A voice, familiar, gentle, whispered in his ear. "You shouldn't have come." Elliot spun around, but no one was there. Elliot could feel it, the pulse of the house, the weight of its history pressing in on him from all sides. It wasn't just the walls or the shadows, not just the whispers he couldn't explain. There was something deeper, something older that had been buried for far too long. And now it was waking. The house creaked and groaned around him, the floorboards moaning like a living thing. It was as though the entire structure was shifting, realigning itself for something he wasn't supposed to understand. The air in the hallway felt thick with dread, every step he took making his head feel heavier, his thoughts slower, as if something was pressing down on his mind. The whispering voice had returned, too, murmuring just beneath the threshold of his hearing, a voice so close he could feel the breath against his ear. "You shouldn't have come. You can't leave." Elliot tried to push it away. He couldn't focus on it. He couldn't let it drown him. He needed to get out. There had to be a way. He had to escape this place before whatever was haunting it completely consumed him. But the stranger's words kept echoing in his mind. "Asterisk, you won't be leaving. Not tonight, asterisk." The storm outside had passed, but it had left something behind. The quiet felt unnatural, suffocating. There was a heaviness in the stillness that filled every corner of the house, pressing in on him from all sides. The silence was too perfect, too complete. His eyes flickered to the small, cracked photograph of the family, now resting on the counter in the kitchen. The faces in the photo, those hollow eyes, seemed to follow him no matter where he went. They had changed. He hadn't imagined it. The faces had shifted, slowly contorting into something grotesque, something unsettling. The air around him felt colder now, and Elliot knew, it wasn't just the storm. This was something else, something darker. And then the sound came, a slow, methodical tapping. It started at the top of the stairs and echoed through the empty house. Tap, tap, tap. Elliot froze. He tried to convince himself it was just the house settling, that it was nothing. But the sound grew louder, more persistent. Tap, tap, tap. His breath quickened. He had to find out what it was. It had to be something, anything, that made sense. The tapping continued, each strike of it louder than the last, as if it were coming closer, as if something, or someone, was making its way down the stairs. His legs shook as he took a step toward the staircase. The steps creaked beneath his feet as if protesting his every move. He looked up, squinting into the dark, but saw nothing. The house felt alive in a way that unsettled him to his core. The walls seemed to watch him. The silence suffocated him, as though the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. And then he saw it. A shadow flickered at the top of the stairs, just out of his line of sight. For a brief moment, it seemed to hang there, suspended in the air, before it moved, slowly, deliberately, toward the landing. The tapping had stopped, replaced by an eerie, unnatural stillness. No. No. Elliot couldn't stop himself. He had to go up there. His feet moved against his better judgment, each step bringing him closer to the darkness that awaited him. The air grew colder the higher he climbed, the very atmosphere pressing in on him with a suffocating weight. His breath came out in shallow gasps as he reached the top of the stairs, the hallway stretching out before him like a shadowed labyrinth. And then the voice came again. This time it was louder. Help me? Elliot's head spun. He felt dizzy, his mind clouded. The voice was faint, a whisper in the darkness, but it was there. And it wasn't the voice of the stranger. It wasn't even the voice of someone alive. Elliot reached out a trembling hand, his fingers brushing against the cold, splintering wood of the door to the farthest room. It was ajar, just barely, the darkness inside a yawning void that seemed to swallow the light. The voice came again. Help me. Elliot pushed the door open, his heart pounding in his chest, the noise deafening in his ears. The room beyond was a time capsule, frozen in place, untouched for years, maybe decades. Dust hung in the air, the only movement the slow, creeping crawl of time. And there, in the center of the room, was an old, decaying chair, its wooden frame cracked and splintered. Tattered, fraying ropes were tied to the arms, the remnants of some long-forgotten ritual. The walls were covered in symbols, dark and twisted, drawn in what looked like blood. They spiraled, converging on a single point, right in front of him. At the center of the symbols was a small, blackened object, barely visible beneath a layer of dust. A symbol had been etched into its surface, a shape he recognized but couldn't quite place. The voice came again, louder now. Help me, Elliot's hands shook as he stepped forward, closer to the chair, closer to the object. He had to know. He had to understand. The object was a small, black stone, cracked in places, its surface rough and uneven. The moment his fingers brushed against it, the room seemed to pulse, the air thickening, warping. His vision swam as a low hum filled the room, vibrating through his bones, through his very soul. And then the voice screamed. Leave. The walls seemed to twist around him, the floor buckling beneath his feet as the house groaned, its foundation rattling as though the very structure was coming alive. Shadows poured from the corners of the room, swirling around him, reaching for him. The stone in his hand burned with an unnatural heat, and the voice, continued to scream, filling his mind with terror. Help me, Elliot. The darkness grew, suffocating him, drowning him in its weight. The shadows wrapped around him, pulling him toward the center of the room, toward the chair. He fought, his heart racing as he tried to break free, but the shadows held him fast. And then, suddenly, everything stopped. The house was silent again, the shadows retreating into the corners. The air felt thin, empty. The stone was gone. Elliot's breath came in shallow gasps as he stumbled back from the room, his mind reeling. His eyes darted around, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But nothing made sense. The house was still. Too still. And then he heard it. A whisper. Not from the house, but from inside his own head. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to. Elliot spun around, his hands trembling. The room was empty. No shadows. No figure. Nothing. The door slammed shut behind him, the sound of it echoing through the house, and Elliot was left standing in the dark, alone. Elliot's mind was reeling, his vision blurring as the house seemed to close in around him. He needed to get out, he had to. The whispers, the tapping, the voices calling his name, they weren't just random, he realized. They were connected to him, to his past, his memories. The house had known him before he had even arrived. He turned toward the door, toward the exit that had seemed so close just moments ago, but as he reached for the handle, the lights flickered and went out once more. And then, from the depths of the house, came the unmistakable sound of footsteps, coming closer. The footsteps drew closer, slow and deliberate, echoing through the hollow spaces of the house. Elliot's heart raced, each beat louder than the last. He could hear them clearly now, the unmistakable sound of heavy boots dragging across the floor, as though the very earth beneath him was being forced into motion. He spun around, his hands trembling as he fumbled for the door handle. But the door wouldn't open. It was as if the house itself had grown teeth, closing itself off, trapping him inside. The footsteps stopped. Silence. He didn't dare breathe, didn't dare move. The darkness seemed to close in around him, suffocating him in its grip. He strained his ears, listening for any sign of what was coming, but all he heard was his own frantic heartbeat, pounding in his chest like the ticking of a clock. And then, without warning, the whisper returned. It was soft at first, like a breath against his ear. Elliot. His name. That voice. Was familiar. So familiar. He spun around again, his eyes scanning the room, but there was no one there. Just the walls. The door. The shadows that clung to every corner. The voice came again, this time louder. Elliot, you shouldn't be here. He froze. His breath caught in his throat. The voice. It was his mother's. The realization hit him like a punch to the stomach. He hadn't thought of her in years, not since the accident. Not since she'd disappeared. But there it was. Her voice. Soft, warm, and so heartbreakingly familiar. Mom? He whispered, his voice breaking as he spoke the word that had haunted him for so long. Mom, is that you? For a moment, nothing happened. The house was still, the air thick with tension. And then, slowly, a figure began to take shape in the darkness, its form emerging from the shadows like a slow-moving fog. It was her. Her hair was the same as he remembered, soft and dark, cascading around her shoulders like it used to when she'd tuck him in at night. But her face, it was different, twisted, hollow. Her eyes were wide, too wide, staring at him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. Elliot, she whispered again, her voice trembling. You should have stayed away. Elliot's stomach lurched, and a wave of nausea washed over him. He took a step backward, his mind racing. This wasn't possible. His mother had been gone for years. How could she? Leave, she said, the words more forceful now, filled with an urgency he hadn't heard before. Leave before it's too late. His pulse quickened. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The room seemed to spin around him as his mother's figure loomed closer, her twisted face drawing nearer, until her breath was hot against his skin. Leave, Elliot. Her hand reached out, her fingers cold and skeletal, but he couldn't move. He couldn't breathe. Her touch was icy, penetrating, and he felt the chill spread through his chest, as though her very presence was pulling the warmth from his body. And then, as quickly as it had come, the vision vanished. The room went black. Elliot collapsed to his knees, gasping for air, his mind reeling. Was it real? Had he just seen his mother? Or had the house done something to him, played on his deepest fears and memories? He didn't know, didn't care. The air around him was suffocating, each breath sharp and painful, as if the house itself were choking him. The whisper returned. You never should have come back. Elliot's chest tightened. His head spun, dizziness creeping in at the edges of his vision. He fought the overwhelming sense that he was losing control. That the house, the voices, the memories, they were all pulling him into something he couldn't escape. And then he remembered the stone, the object in the room with the ropes, the blackened stone he had touched. He stood up, his legs shaky beneath him, and turned toward the hallway. He couldn't stay here. He couldn't let the house consume him. He needed to find the stone again. Maybe, maybe. It held the answers. Maybe it held the key to getting out of this nightmare. As he stepped into the hallway, a familiar weight settled in his gut. He wasn't alone. Someone, or something, was watching him. Elliot's skin prickled. His breath quickened. The shadows seemed to pulse around him, drawing in tighter. He glanced over his shoulder, but there was nothing there. Nothing but the dark, empty space that had been watching him from the edges of his sight. And then, Elliot. The voice was there again, echoing in the hollow air, but this time it was different. It wasn't his mother. It wasn't the stranger. This voice was his. It was his own voice. Elliot froze. His mouth went dry as the voice continued, as if coming from somewhere deep inside him, twisting and contorting his thoughts. "You shouldn't have come back," it whispered, each word seeping into his mind like poison. "The house remembers you. It remembers what you did." He backed away, his heart hammering in his chest. What was happening? Why did the house? Why did this thing know him so well? No, he gasped, shaking his head violently. "I didn't do anything. I don't." But the voice only grew louder. "You killed her." The words cut through him like a blade. Elliot's knees gave out beneath him. He collapsed to the floor, the weight of the revelation crashing into him like a wave. The room spun. His mother's face flashed in his mind, twisted, anguished. The accident. The fire. The screams. The memory of the moment when he had let her go, the guilt. The guilt that had haunted him for years, dragging him deeper into the darkness. He hadn't been able to save her. He hadn't been able to stop it. And now the house knew. It had known all along. A soft rustling sound pulled him from his thoughts. He looked up, his breath caught in his throat. The walls were moving. Not the usual creaks. Not the house settling. The walls themselves were breathing. The shadows around him swirled as if the very structure of the house was alive, pulling in the air, shifting with a mind of its own. And in the center of it all, standing before him, was the black stone. The one he had touched. It was glowing now, an eerie light pulsing from within its cracks. Elliot stumbled toward it, his body moving before his mind could process it. He reached out, his hands shaking, and as soon as his fingers brushed against the stone, the world around him shattered. A scream tore from his throat. The walls closed in faster now, the air thin and choking. The darkness enveloped him, and he could feel himself being pulled apart, his consciousness unraveling like a loose thread. And then, just before everything went black, the last thing he heard was the voice, softer now, like a whisper in the storm. "You should have stayed away, Elliot." Elliot's breath came in short, ragged gasps as he tumbled backward, his hands bracing against the cold floor. His body felt like it was on fire, every nerve alive with fear. The walls pulsed around him, the house shifting, its once solid structure now bending, twisting as if it had a life of its own. The stone in his hand burned like an inferno, and his vision swam with the intensity of the pain. For a moment he couldn't move. He could only lie there, overwhelmed, the house pressing in on him from all sides, its darkness wrapping around him like a suffocating blanket. And then a thought broke through the haze. The door. The door to the cellar. His heart hammered in his chest. He didn't know why the thought of that door haunted him so deeply, but he felt it. There was something there, something that held the key to everything. To his past. To the truth. The stone. His mother's voice. The whispers. Elliot forced himself to his feet, the weight of the house pressing down on him, the air thick and unbearable. The voices were growing louder, more insistent, filling his mind with their relentless echoes. "You know what you did," they hissed. "You can never leave." He stumbled forward, the ground beneath him seemingly shifting with each step, as if the very house were trying to swallow him whole. He didn't care anymore. The house, the voices, the shadows, they were nothing compared to the urge to escape. He reached the basement door, his hands trembling as he gripped the handle. His stomach churned with dread, but there was no turning back now. The whispers told him he could never leave, but the door was the way out. It had to be. He wrenched it open. The stairs below were steep, disappearing into the thick, suffocating darkness. The air was colder here, damp with the weight of years, decades perhaps, of neglect. The smell of mold, decay, and something faintly metallic hung in the air. Elliot took a breath and descended, his every step echoing in the silence. The further he went, the heavier the air became. His thoughts seemed to slow, each one pulling him deeper into the past, into memories he had tried so hard to bury. He didn't want to remember. He didn't want to think about the fire. The crash. His mother's face twisted in agony. The screams. But he couldn't stop it. And then he saw it. At the bottom of the stairs was a door, small, wooden, and old, covered in the same dark symbols he had seen before. Symbols that didn't belong to any language he knew. The door seemed out of place, as if it didn't belong in the house at all. As if it were a separate reality, a gateway to something far worse. Elliot's chest tightened. The whispers in his mind grew louder, but now they were frantic, filled with terror. "Don't open it. Leave. It's too late." But Elliot wasn't listening anymore. He knew, this was the end. This was where it all began. This was where the house and everything that had happened would be revealed. He reached out, his fingers brushing the cold, decaying wood of the door. His heart raced as he gripped the handle and turned. The door creaked open. Inside there was nothing but darkness. But as he stepped forward, the shadows seemed to retreat, as if drawing away from something. From him. The room was small, only a few feet across, but it felt like it stretched on forever. At the center of the room was an old, iron-bound chest, its surface cracked and scarred, as though it had been through something terrible. Something ancient. Elliot took a step toward it, his hands trembling. The voices were almost deafening now, their urgency rising to a crescendo. But he didn't stop. He opened the chest. Inside there was nothing but dust. Nothing but the remnants of a life long forgotten. And then he saw it. At the very bottom, half buried beneath the ashes, was a small photograph yellowed with age. It was of a young boy, no older than 8 or 9. His face was pale, his eyes wide with terror. But what caught Elliot's eye was the writing on the back of the photo. Asterisk, my son. Remember. Remember what you did. Asterisk. Elliot's blood ran cold. His mind reeled. The face in the photo. It was him. It was his own face. He stumbled backward, the photograph falling from his hand. His heart thudded painfully in his chest, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The whispers reached a fever pitch, their voices now indistinguishable from the pounding of his heart. He remembered. It had been him. He had been the one. The fire. The crash. The screams. His mother had died because of him, because of his carelessness, his selfishness. He had left her. He had run. And now the house was punishing him. The walls began to close in, the room shrinking, the air growing thinner. He was suffocating. And then, in the darkest corner of the room, a figure stepped forward. It was his mother. Her eyes were black voids, her face gaunt and twisted, but it was her. Her hands reached out toward him, long and skeletal, her mouth opening wide as if to speak. But no words came. Only a hollow, bone-chilling scream. Elliot backed away, his body crashing against the wall, but the figure was closing in on him, faster now, her hands reaching for his throat. He had nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The house had him. And then, just as it seemed the darkness would swallow him whole, the figure stopped. It was silent again. The weight of the house lifted. The air cleared. And Elliot was alone. Or was he? He stood there, trembling in the cold, empty room. The figure was gone. The chest, the photograph, gone. The house had returned to its stillness, its shadows lingering, waiting. But something had changed. Something had ended. Elliot looked toward the stairs. The door at the top was wide open. The house was no longer holding him. But neither was it letting him go. He walked slowly toward the exit, the weight of his guilt lifting, only to be replaced by an overwhelming sense of dread. He didn't know what was real anymore. He didn't know if he had truly escaped, or if he was still trapped in the same nightmare, bound to the house forever. As his foot hit the threshold, the whisper came again. Asterisk, you can never leave, asterisk. Elliot paused, but he didn't turn back. He stepped outside into the night air, the fog swirling around him, thick and suffocating. And somewhere in the distance, the house whispered, Asterisk, I'll never forget, asterisk. And for the first time, Elliot was truly alone.